remember that date, 1783. So, as Becky has said, we're delighted to be here working with the University of the Highlands and Islands and HI. This is our second conference dealing with matters of the present, and it's great that we've got a great range of speakers over the next 2 days. So without any further ado, given that our first speaker has arrived, and I'm delighted to see our first speaker, I'm going to introduce Professor Neil Simco, Deputy Principal for Academic and Research Work in the UHI, which is a very tough gig at the moment with various challenges. Neil oversees the development and delivery of the university's Gaelic language plan. He played a key role in setting up the 2 new universities, the UHI, which we have, and the University of Cumbria, and there's a very close relationship between the two. But Neil started his professional life as a primary school teacher, and I'm delighted to say he's director of the Kylan Sutherland Development Trust, which is based just 5 miles from where I grew up. So Neil, you are very welcome. Please welcome Neil, who's going to give us an introduction to the UHI Island Strategy. Neil.
Well, Fescamar Harchin, it's really good to be here this afternoon, and it's a fantastic privilege for University of the Highlands and Islands to work in partnership with the FRSE on this programme of events. We met at Solmorostig last June, I think, here today for today and tomorrow's session as well. So it's great to celebrate that partnership. I've just got a very short slot to talk about our UHI Island strategy. And I've got a very few copies here for colleagues who may have a particular interest. But I wanted to, as I say, just say a very few words about the island strategy. Colleagues will know that UHI spans across the whole of the Highlands and Islands region, but also includes Perthshire and Morayshire as well. And as part of our work, we wanted to place emphasis on our commitment and contribution to the islands within our geographical area. So it was decided about 5 or 6 years ago that we should formalise an island strategy. And at that point, we held a series of discussions, we being myself plus the academic partner principals, with the local authorities, with Highlands and Islands Enterprise, with Skills Development Scotland, with Bors na Gaeilge and other key stakeholders. And working together, we developed the islands strategy that we now have in place. This is what I'm talking about today is actually the revamped island strategy, because of course so much has changed in society over the last 5 years, given COVID and so on and so forth. So our island strategy has a series of key aims, which I'll very briefly speak to. I know my time here is very short. It has a series of key aims which really together summarise what we're trying to achieve. So first, there are actually five things just to talk about very briefly. So first of all, we highlight our commitment to working with stakeholders to develop a skilled workforce across the islands. And when we say skilled workforce, this is at all levels, because UHI has students at every level, from further education, including senior phase in school and prior to senior phase, right the way up to PhDs. So we want to use our strategy to develop a skilled workforce, supporting the creation and retention of workers in key sectors in the islands. And of course, some of the work here in Stornoway is absolutely critical to meeting that particular aim. Secondly, we talk, our second key theme is around impactful postgraduate learning and research. And we're actually incredibly fortunate within UHI in the islands to have a number of research centres and institutes, and also research centres and institutes that work in the islands, even if they're not based in the islands. So examples here, in particular, we're talking about our provision in culture, heritage, archaeology. We have our Institute of Archaeology in Orkney, for example, marine science, creative industries, and Gaelic. And we're very fortunate to have Professor Crocker Gilligan here, who is our Gaelic professor and leads some really important Gaelic work in the islands, as many folks around the conference here will know. So our aspiration through this strategy is to increase the profile of postgraduate learning and research in island communities. And I'm pleased to say that the number of PhD students across the islands is actually growing at the current time. Thirdly, we're looking to implement the Islands Growth Deal and in part the Argyll and Bute Growth Deal, both of which have iteration with the islands. And we're involved in a number of projects in the Islands Growth Deal, and Hannah, who's here today, for example, is involved with Talent Ed, which relates directly back to the skills agenda. So, we're involved in the Islands Growth Deals. There's the campus development here in Stornoway. There's a campus development in Shetland. There's something called Talent Ed, which we're running with RGU and Harriet Watt, that's all about skills and developing skills and entrepreneurship in the islands. We're involved in Creative Islands as well, and we're involved in a specialist project in Shetland called Shelvolution, which is all about mussels and supporting the mussel industry in Shetland. So that connectivity between the university and the growth deals we consider to be very important and has a theme of its own. Fourthly, we have the theme of thriving languages and cultures, and a key part of that, of course, is our work to support the languages, dialects and cultures through the islands. And again, Gaelic is absolutely critical to that. But we do use the phrase languages and cultures because equally important, of course, is the work we do, for example, in Shetland around the Shetland dialect and the Nordic culture as well. We try to be respectful and recognise the different languages and cultures and dialects throughout the islands. And finally, we have a theme of which we call sustainable communities, and that's all about attracting new activity and people into the islands, obviously through UHI Northwestern Hebrides here in Stornoway, through UHI Orkney and through UHI Shetland. There are hundreds of people who live and work in the communities in the islands, and we also have folks working in the university centrally, as it were, based in the islands as well. And that's something that we want to continue with, to attract new activity, attract people to the islands and to support the economy in the islands. So these are the key themes in our island strategy. We have a twice yearly Islands Forum with key stakeholders that I mentioned, the local authorities, SDS, HIE, etc. And we rotate that round. So the last one was in Shetland in September 23. The next one's, it's a bit like RSE. The next one's in Orkney in this September, and I think we'll be back in Stornoway in 2025 is the plan. And that Islands Forum has a role to monitor, support, challenge the island strategy document. So I commend it to you. I've got some hard copies here. There's not enough for everybody, but I have got hard copies here. But obviously it's available on the UHI website as well. And many thanks. Morantang.
Thank you, Neil. Neil, we're good for time. So if there are any questions, I'm sure you'd be happy to take them. Any thoughts or questions? One from me, Neil, is just thinking about the audience for this. I mean, who's the big audience that you're trying to reach here?
Yeah, the big audience. In essence, I think that the big audience is around I suppose it's around building the confidence of our key stakeholders that we are working in collaboration for the benefit of communities in the island. So our key audience are organisations like, particularly the local authorities, that we have to work in really close partnership with. And in fact, as some will know, UHI Orkney itself is part of Orkney Islands Council. So there's a piece there about the local authorities and ensuring, I suppose, that through the local authorities, that communities see that we are serious about our ongoing commitment to the islands. It's also the case that we iterate with Scottish Government in matters to do with our island strategy, that they've been part of deliberations as well. So I think it's about, I suppose, building confidence that as the only university that is fully based in the Highlands and Islands, Perthshire and Morayshire, that we are serious about our long-term commitment to our island communities, principally through the island academic partners, but also involving, of course, the UHI more generally.
Well, of course, it's great you're mentioning so many PhD students based in the Isles, and hopefully we'll get postdocs and the establishment of some research projects as well.
Yeah, there's a huge amount of research going on in the islands, everything from our work with Gaelic communities, to marine science. We have our Institute of Archaeology, I mentioned, based in Orkney. So there is, world-leading research going on under UHI's umbrella across the islands. That's the reality just now. Northern Studies, we have our Institute of Northern Studies as well, which is based in Orkney, Shetland, and Perth. So this is something that is unique. It's something that is very distinctive. It's something that's very special. It's something that's incredibly difficult to organise because it's very dispersed. It is not like a traditional university with a traditional graduate school in a building. These people are spread, across the island communities. But we believe it's really important, and we want to continue to build it and grow it despite the immense challenges of our time.
Yeah, well, I see them as opportunities. So it's very important. Thank you. Any other questions? Fantastic.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you.
Look forward to having a copy.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. It's interesting, you mentioned mussels, working on mussels. The fairly newly appointed chairman of Nature Scot, formerly known as Scottish Natural Heritage, is Professor Colin Galbraith, and he took his PhD on mussel farming. He's got a great interest in mussels, so get him over here to encourage you. Now, our next speaker is someone who's become a very good friend of mine, Professor Chris Whatley, who is very much the initiator of this conference series. Chris is one of our foremost Scottish historians. He's written at length on the salt industry, which is a fascinating topic, and Scotland's Industrial Revolution. He wrote the definitive book, The Scots and the Union, which garnered many awards and much acclaim. He's actually written many books, including Bought and Sold for English Gold and Immortal Memory, assessing the legacy of Robert Burns. And most recently, he produced the acclaimed book Pabe, An Island Odyssey. So it's a very special pleasure to have Chris join us here to give us an introduction to the islands. And Chris, you were saying this is very much for our wonderful online audience, as well as people here. So Chris, welcome.
Right, well, thanks very much, Des, and thank you for being here. The feedback, we got a lot of feedback from our event in Skye a year ago, but there was an idea or suggestion that it would have been useful if we'd provided an introduction to the topic, Scotland's islands, and why we're interested in them, and we should do this before the specialist talks, if you like. So what I'm going to be doing in the next few minutes really is explain why we're here, basically. This is especially for the online audience. A lot of this stuff will be familiar to people here, and if you know it all, I do apologise. I have no pictures, it's just me. why we're looking at Scotland's islands and why our session today and tomorrow are focused on the islands as they are presently. There are two major reasons why the RSE, in association with our partners UHI and HIE, have embarked on the island series of meetings. The first is part of the Royal Society of Edinburgh's mission, so to speak, current mission, which is to get out of Edinburgh and the Central Belt to other parts of Scotland. The RSE can hardly claim to be Scotland's academy or to speak authoritatively about Scotland if it's not connected or liaising with and listening to people with knowledge and concerns and perspectives, and not least ideas from all parts of the country. The RSE is a body which is frequently called upon by the Scottish Government on policy matters, and to do so effectively means that that what we have to say is based on as much evidence as is possible and to be as comprehensive and inclusive as we can be. Expertise is not something that's to be found only in Edinburgh and Glasgow. It abounds in all corners of Scotland, and so for all of our sakes, if Scotland is to be all it aspires to be, this needs to be tapped. So in order to do this, on part of the RSE, Des and I were asked to take the RSE into the north and west, which of course includes the islands, the Inner and Outer Hebrides and in the west, and of course Orkney and Shetland in the north. So the second reason, that's the first reason, the second reason we kicked off our activities in the islands is that they're a unique feature of the north and west of Scotland. Not always recognised, and this is for people who are unfamiliar with the islands. There are around 800 of them. And they're often overlooked, even if they're much visited during the summertime anyway. Much has been written about the islands, too often by misty-eyed journalists and other fair weather travellers, who, to be fair, do slightly better than the visitors who come on to the island that I'm most familiar, which is Skye, with the intention of doing the island in a day. All of which means that Scotland's islands aren't as well understood as they should be, or haven't been, because this is changing, not least through the research work that people like Neil have just referred to, the UHI, HIED, community groups, and individuals, many of whom are here with us this weekend, which is great, and I'm looking forward to hearing a lot of things and learning a lot that I don't know about. I've just had a lecturette about soy sheep, which so I got that totally wrong. So later on we'll hear more about that. So anyway, we were determined to get to Skye and Harris and Lewis and elsewhere in order to begin to forge links with the people of these places, to take any expertise the RSE has out to the islands, but even more important, in fact much more important, is to listen and learn about places that aren't always part of what you might call the national conversation, but should be. So to cut a long story short, we thought we'd set up a series of 3 events, one looking at the islands past, one looking at the islands present, and another looking at how Scotland's islands might fare in the future. And this third one will be held in Orkney later this year. So, in order to set the scenes for this island's present session, I'm going to summarise some of the points that arose from the island's past session that was held in Skye in 2023. And I hope that either directly or indirectly, these will inform the discussions we'll be having today and tomorrow. So this is really a bit of background, and especially, as I say, for our online viewers, but people here who weren't involved in the Skye event. I guess if there was a big take-home point, it was the observation, which seems almost banal, that Scotland's islands are very different from each other. Sure, they have in common the fact that they're surrounded on all sides by the sea. Yes, many are similar, but there's also a huge variation in size, from skerries and small rocky islands on the one extreme to enormous land masses on the other. Where we are today, Lewis and Harris is the biggest, as many people here don't need to be told, 800 square miles, or well over 2,000 square kilometres. These islands, of course, have been affected by, in ancient time, by geology and long-term climatic change or climatic action, which have created much of the form of the islands and have created the opportunities and the limitations there are for human beings living on them. Some islands are mountainous, others are flat, a few are fertile, others less so. And even within one island, the terrain can vary, as here with Harris's Mountains, and the peat mosses, if you like, of Lewis. Most, though, are affected to a greater extent than other parts of the country by the weather. The Western Islands are exposed to the prevailing western winds, and in some places to a higher rainfall. Both of these present challenges that are generally less acute than on other more favoured parts of the mainland. But I'll come back to these challenges in a couple of minutes. Another point that came across, and again it might be obvious to people here, but another point that came across powerfully at what I'll call the Skye Gathering is that how we look at a map of Scotland has in large part determined how we see and interpret the significance of Scotland's islands. Looked at traditionally, they're on the left and at the top, although in the case of Shetland, not always at the top when it's relocated to a box alongside Orkney or maybe stuck out in the North Sea somewhere. But from this perspective, they're peripheral, far from the centres of power, Edinburgh and Glasgow. Or if you live in Skye, the problem is you're distant from Inverness. Yet to turn the map on its side and coming from the west, here is where you first see Scottish islands, or first see Scotland actually, as anyone who's flown back from Canada or the USA will know. Once you've had the overnight flight, let's say, and you come in and you see Tiree and so on and so forth, and it's a wonderful sight to be back home. The same is true if you turn the map upside down. Shetland first, then Orkney, and thereafter the mainland. And this actually is important, for what was also remarked by a number of speakers in Skye was how in former times, 1,000 or more years ago, and up until the 14th century, it was the North and Western Islands that the Scandinavians wanted to control, and did, on their journey south through the Minches on the way to the Isle of Man, to Ireland and the Mediterranean. And from the islands, they replenished their stores of food, and even seized people who they then sold as slaves in Dublin. In other words, far from being peripheral, Scotland's northern and western islands were on one of the most important sea routes in Western Europe, far from the edge, which is a term which is sometimes used by present-day writers in the Hebrides, but they were on the Viking Age's equivalent of the maritime M1. But the Scandinavians settled here too, as we know, and the traces of the importance of the islands in question to the Scandinavians are still with us in place names, artifacts, genetics and culture. And on this last subject, culture, we learnt too how integral to island culture in the past were oral tradition and language, which continue to be part of the fabric of island society now, despite now and have been for many centuries under immense challenge. But we'll hear more about that tomorrow. But we also learned of some outstanding academic and especially community projects that are ensuring that the past isn't lost, and indeed that it's being actively deployed for the present and the future. For a mainland dweller like myself, one of the most remarkable and inspirational features of the island we're on today is the existence of and work being done by the historical societies. You know, the local ones around here, Stornoway and Ness. These, if you like, I see as being kind of memory hubs which have the power to energise activities in the present and indeed in the future. But as we heard in Skye, it wasn't only Scandinavians who wanted to control the islands. For centuries, the indigenous lords of the Isles ruled the Western Islands, not the King or Scotland's Parliament. It was only in the 17th century that King James VI determined to bring the islands and the islands' leaders, the clan chiefs, into his sphere of interest and under his thumb. And a question we might ask today is the extent to which government from Holyrood has been, or is at present, good for the islands, and what are its failings? Where is the appropriate place for policy making and decisions? In these parts, there's been a strong historical belief, in terms of the sort of things I've been reading from some of you, a strong historical belief in local democracy, self-determination. So maybe Holyrood isn't the best place for that. Regardless of the answer to these questions, what I think we can tentatively suggest is this. and this is me as a historian trying to make some sense of these bits and pieces of information. It's the nature of history that it marches on through time and never stops. What's true now is not always as it was, and how things are now need not determine the future. Circumstances change and new opportunities arise. This takes us to something which, at one level, the islands have had in common, and that is the problem of depopulation. It's been a problem for at least 150 years, and it continues to be a problem. Every week I read the West Highland Free Press, and there's usually some story which is concerned with yet another, not clearance, but another departure or a risk to communities of people departing from such places, well, not so much nowadays to America and Canada, but that was the 19th and early 20th century experience, or to the Scottish lowlands. And that's the loss of people. Now, since 1861, we heard in Skye, and up to the census of 2001, the population of Scotland's islands fell from between 5 and 6% of the whole to around 2%. Now, at first sight, this is a dismal tale of ever-decreasing numbers of island dwellers, although there was an upturn between 2001 and 2011. Decline is neither inevitable nor inexorable. I can't talk about the most recent census, the data which is now available. That would be cheating, because that wasn't said, that wasn't used in our talk in last year. But the global numbers only take us so far. Much depends on island size. The number of inhabited islands fell by, the number of uninhabited islands fell by over 50% between 1861 and 2011. The number of inhabited islands. But the islands that experienced the sharpest falls and were more likely to become uninhabited, were the smaller ones. And in some cases, the falls were dramatic. Near here, for instance, is Pabby off Harris, in 1841. Before the island was cleared largely for sheep, the population stood at 338. 10 years later, the number was 25, and by the end of the last century, no one was left. It's the larger islands that have done better, Orkney, Shetland, Mull, Arran, and Skye, for instance, that over the past 50 years seen increases in their populations, although none have recovered to their 19th century peaks. Now, one of the small islands was one that my family lived on, and that I've written about and talked about during the Skye session, and that's Pabby, the island of Broadford on Skye. At its peak in 1841, there were 4 or 5 families there. After the potato famine of the 1840s, there was only 1 household on the island, and fewer than that for a century. In fact, for a time, nobody lived there at all. That is until 1950, when my folks went out there. During the intervening period, Pabby had been turned over to cattle and sheep, and in effect became a live larder for the Lords MacDonald and their guests at Armadale Castle. But I won't say anything more about landowners right now, and there's others who will talk about such things today and tomorrow. My own family tried for 20 years or so to make a living on the island, but in the end had to give up. They were defeated by some of the same factors that led to the abandonment of hundreds of small islands in the century beforehand. In fact, I often think that if I had been old enough when my uncle and aunt went to live there in 1950, if I had known then what I know now about the problems of living on small islands, I'd have said, don't do it. But anyway, they did. And I won't go into this in any great detail, but I will draw out a couple of points that the Pabby example illustrates, if you like. Surrounded by sea, and often rough seas, Scotland's islands are critically dependent on sea transport, reliable sea transport. I explained on Skye last year that on Pabby, my uncle lost 14 boats in less than 20 years. The reasons for this were various, the lack of a safe anchorage when the wind was blowing from the east, and the inability to pay for improvements. This lack of finance, too, meant that he was only able to afford second-hand boats that were often in poor shape and prone to leak or hard to manoeuvre at sea. There was a particularly rocky approach to the island, all of which meant that for periods when the family was cut off, or times when it was impossible to get livestock, or there were times when the farm was cut off and it was impossible to get livestock off the island at optimum moments. So my uncle had a business supplying day-old chicks, not only to Skye but out here as well. But buyers are less interested in 2 or 3 week old chicks, so there was a problem there. But his experience, as I say, simply mirrored that of thousands of people in similar situations over the centuries living on such places. The challenges presented by the sea are more acute on small islands, or so I'd have said until recently. But we've seen in the more recent past that substandard vessels, inadequate infrastructure and a lack of investment can have an adverse effect on transport links for the bigger islands too. I best say nothing about government interference on the part of politicians in search of favourable headlines. I didn't say that, but there's no doubt that this has exacerbated the problem. More important, perhaps, is that the current situation does seem to justify us asking the question of how aware is mainland government of the unique challenges faced by those living on the islands. Indigenous factors such as ingenuity and resilience and determined community action, so much of which we've seen out here and elsewhere in the islands in recent decades, perhaps many decades, can only take us so far. That's a question, really. Returning to Pabby and the problems of making a living on the smaller islands, and in parts of the larger islands too. Other factors driving people to the mainland included the sheer brutality of the weather, wind in particular, lack of capital to drain wet boggy land and dig ditches, to fence, and social isolation. But above all, what we heard on Skye on this sort of issue is the question of critical mass. To survive and thrive, there have to be key and sometimes unique local industries or activities that create employment and sufficient numbers of people to provide and support essential services such as healthcare and education and housing at affordable prices. Without these, people leave, as has happened in South Uist, whereas with them, populations can grow, as on Skye or here in Stornoway. So, this has been a rapid resume of the kinds of issues that were raised during the island's past event in Skye. What our focus is for the next couple of days is the island's present. And I guess questions worth asking, and there may be many more than these, include the following. What is the situation in Scotland's islands now? Or I should really say, what are the situations in Scotland's islands now, as I'm acutely conscious of the huge differences there are in the economies and social structures of the various islands. So this weekend, much of our focus will necessarily be on Harris and Lewis and the Outer Hebrides. But if we were meeting in Brodick or Lerwick or Tobermory, the story would be different. Not vastly different, but there would be differences. Another question might be the extent to which the past has influenced the present, adversely and otherwise, and it'll be good to hear too about ways in which the problems of the past have now been turned on their head. So, for example, wind has from at least the 18th century been seen by commentators and locals and outside observers as a destructive force. But it's now being harnessed and generating electricity and money for communities in those places where wind farms have been, in some of those places, where wind farms have been constructed. And this is where there's been community involvement, generally, as far as I can see, and the turbines are of a moderate size, and unlike the proposals which some of you might know about on Skye right now, which are rather high, to say the least. Kelp's another example. That was a boom industry and then a disaster for many island communities in the late 18th century, early 19th century. But it's now re-established in the Uists and elsewhere on Scotland's west coast. It's being revived in Skye. Off the island of Pabby, which I'm familiar with, kelp used to bind our propellers, if you like, but now there's a kelp farm where we had once have kept clear of is now producing kelp. And it's worth, not Pabby, but the industry as a whole is worth over £70 million a year. But happily, the kelp industry nowadays is without the wretched working conditions endured during the industry's first phase, which was a golden age for the landlords, but rather a period of rather horrific working conditions for anyone else. But developments like these in turn raise questions relating to the environment, for wildlife and the landscape, issues that weren't all that pressing in former times. So, where are we? I've said enough. I was going to say it's now time to leave the past and turn to today. But I'm pretty sure what we're going to hear now is the extent that the past still informs the present. Learning from it, what is to be avoided, but at the same time understanding from the past what is possible. So that takes us into the 21st century, March 2024. I look forward to the rest of today's and tomorrow's proceedings. Thanks for listening.
That was fantastic, Chris. We're actually ahead of time. So, any questions?
No.
Very well behaved. I mean, the kelp industry.
Yeah.
You know, are there other industries that you can think of like that, Chris, where you know in the past they were viewed as the devil, but now they're a great asset?
Well, there is another. You mentioned kindly in your introduction my work on salt, which was the first academic. Well, not it was part of the first academic project I was ever interested in, and the book came out in 1987. Oh, sorry. Yeah. Last year, 2023, we produced another book on salt, and it's called Salt, Scotland's Newest, Oldest Industry. The industry had actually died out in the 1950s ultimately, but it really died out from the 1850s. It hung on in some parts of East Lothian until the 1950s. But the industry had, to all extents and purposes, died. You talk about, the dreadful conditions, if you like, or you asked me about that. Yes, salt workers were a miserable lot in the sense that the conditions in which they worked were dreadful. These were enclosed pan houses, if you like, which were filled with, it was a 24-hour process, boiling seawater, basically. It was smoky, it was hot, it was steamy, and as I say, the process took a long time, and these characters had to work there 4, 5, 6 days a week. However, in the last 10 years, salt making has been re-established. It began with Skye, Isle of Skye Sea Salt Company. The conditions are very good. There's no fires. It's simply a process where seawater is pumped into polytunnels and allowed to evaporate. And remarkably, in Scotland, it evaporates and it produces a beautiful white salt. And several other new works have been established. There's one in Ayr, there's one in Orkney, I think. There's one in Islay, and there's one in St Monans in Fife. So yes, that old industry is being re-established and is thriving, actually.
It's a brilliant example. Thank you, Chris. Any other questions? Becky, can I check, are there any questions online? Okay.
Oh, very good. Right,
Chris will relieve you.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you, Chris. Can I check if Faye's arrived yet? No. So we've got a wee rejig of the programme here because flights and ferries and other things have been causing a wee bit of consternation, but no probs at all. What we're going to do now is we're going to move to David Cameron and Rona Campbell. We'll then break for tea and coffee. Then we'll go on to Agnes Rennie, and then we'll have a joint Q&A following these two presentations. Then we'll go to Faye, and then to Brian Wilson. Brian, unfortunately, has been detained, but will join us shortly. So if I now turn to our double act of David and Rona, absolutely delighted to have the two of you here. David's played a key role in community purchase and development of the North Harris Estate Trust, an area that I've spent a considerable amount of time. So I'm really personally delighted you're here. You've been chair of Community Energy Scotland, Community Land Trust, Community Land Scotland, David. And Rona is a Senior Development Manager for Population and Talent Attraction at Highlands and Islands Enterprise. You recently got your PhD on Sustainability Studies, so many congratulations for that. Before that, you took an MSc degree as well, and I think published a book on that under the supervision of the redoubtable Frank Rennie, who we'll hear from tomorrow. And you were a very much enjoyed presence on radio, television, covering news, sport and politics until around, I think, 2007, when you decided on a career change to focus on business and economic development. So greatly looking forward to hearing from you both. And without further ado, Rona first, then David. Rona, thank you.
This is water. To be clear. Thank you very much, Des. It's an honour to be here and to be sharing a platform with David Cameron and later Agnes Rennie, who will both give us the benefit of their experience of community land ownership. But for now, I want to share with you the results of my PhD research, the title of which is here. And just to say that hearing Chris talk about immediate lessons of history, I think this is probably underlining what the research told us, which will become clear, hopefully, in a second. The Outer Hebrides was chosen as a research area because the majority of the population here now live in community-owned estates. Now, is this going to move on? Just a second, we'll just move on to, see if we can get this to move on. There we are, that says. So this is the data set, and for your understanding my position as a researcher, I have never lived here or worked in community-owned estates, but I'm here as often as I possibly can. 12 community land trusts in the Outer Hebrides were contacted to take part in the study. 2 trusts did not take an active part, with 1 providing a written response, but all provided information on the great fact of all this, which was in June 2022, the trust employed 92 full-time employees and 6 seasonal workers, some of which were shared between the land trusts. You can see from the graph that there were additional interviews carried out with people experienced in working in the community-owned land sector across Scotland. The interviews were conducted between March 2020 and September 2021, with only 1 happening face-to-face. And in fact, that is a significant aspect of this, because the research interviews took place during the COVID-19 pandemic, so a live test of resilience for all of us. I want to share with you what the study participants said to me about the pandemic, and later give you an idea of some of the wider issues raised in interviews which shed light on whether community land trusts in the Outer Hebrides provide a model for local development. The next few slides have a lot of quotes on them from people that took part in the study. I'll let you read them while I provide some commentary. Firstly, on the pandemic. There we are. So you can see here what people were saying, the necessary but swift response to keeping people connected, finding parts of genuine poverty in communities, and the development of food banks. And here was the issue, because having tapped into the need for services like prescription deliveries and food banks, how could these services be continued long term? And as the weeks and months passed, communities began to see the impact of the strange way we were living at the time. On the positive side, definitely a sense that the pandemic resulted in the trusts knowing their communities better, for which in turn gave them pause for thought about maybe doing things differently long term. And by reaching people across the community, often for the first time, the study revealed a pattern of isolation which needed to be addressed in an ongoing basis. But it wasn't a smooth transition to remote conversations. I'm sure we all remember at that time. And as the businesses and activities of the trust moved online. You can see here in the third comment what we all came to know as Zoom fatigue, where digital connections did make regular meetings possible, but the online world wasn't necessarily for everybody. Some land trusts were able to supply equipment like iPads to local residents, but even that didn't always work because not everyone either wanted to or had the skills to engage digitally. The impact of the pandemic was enormous for the economy. Tourism ended abruptly, and tourism is a key income stream for some land trusts and their communities. But as you can see here, that didn't change the outlook for many trusts going forward, namely if tourism was their main income, that wasn't going to change. However, some trusts were reflecting on their reliance on tourism, but they were very much in the minority. This may well have changed by now. And as the economy opened up, a new normal emerged, and what maybe has changed for the trust? Well, many had queries from people considering a move to the islands because they could bring their job with them. Also interesting was a sense of a change of direction strategically for some land trusts, and as you can see in the second comment, a true sense of local development and local demand. That in itself prompted other comments of concern from some participants wondering where the line would be in the future in terms of service delivery from either local authorities or national government, or whether communities were going to be expected to provide more services. Many research participants did indicate that land trust staff and volunteers had been thanked for their efforts during and immediately post-pandemic. And by that I mean, as indicated in point 3 here, that people wouldn't have asked for help on their own, but the circumstances meant that the trust connected with them through difficult times. What all this told me was that in a true test of resilience, the Land Trust and the Outer Hebrides rose to the challenge, reaching out to their communities more than before, learning about them, and for the first time finding people who really needed ongoing help. The overall research I carried out looked at a whole range of issues which would test the role of land trusts in sustaining a community. And I was very struck by a couple of comments here. Just a second. Here we are, that's where we want to be. So I was very struck by a couple of comments here, where Gaelic is not just a language issue, but a land issue, and Crofting is not just a land issue, but also a language issue. These interconnected issues are critical here and at the heart of what sustaining communities in the Outer Hebrides looks like now and in the future. So as a model for local development, what did the research tell us about community land trusts in the Outer Hebrides? To do this, I looked at the data, and you've only seen a snippet of it so far, and I used a tool called the Community Capitals Framework to consider this question as a way of measuring change. It was developed by 2 academics, Mary Emery and Cornelia Flora. The research I carried out supported their premise that strong social capital was critical to the sustainability of a community. And I looked at the data I gathered against each capital, and I want to just pick out 3 to explain to you this afternoon. So let's go back to cultural capital in relation to the Gaelic language and look at cultural capital. Cultural capital, I suppose, is a way that people interact with the world and their traditions and their language. And remember, the interviews took place during the pandemic, so that was a time where people had lost their in-person community-based contact, giving the land trusts a crucial role in keeping people connected. That link between the indigenous population and the Gaelic language and the future of language is something participants in the research didn't agree on. That said, the data did indicate a recognition of the connection between land, language, and the future community, as indicated in the quote you saw a minute ago. The Land Trust did not have universally positive responses to their role in the sustainability of Gaelic. Half of those from the Land Trust community did not think the language would survive, other than as part of the heritage and culture of a community. You can see here that some thought the prevalence of English was simply too strong, because one respondent actually told me that although Gaelic was their first language, out they reverted to English very, very quickly because that was what was spoken outside the home. So where the Land Trust respondents said they would react to the desires of their local community in relation to the Gaelic language, there was no consistent pattern of how important this was to them. However, in seeing Gaelic as part of the culture of communities, the study did indicate that the survival of the language was closely linked to sustaining communities here for the Indigenous population, as well as attracting people into the community who were keen to be part of the culture. All of which leads on to this idea of social capital and why it's critical in a community. Social capital being about the networks and the resources which are vital to community land trusts. They're membership organisations, so the land trusts have a foundation of people engaged with their activities. A previous study I did into succession planning, which Des mentioned earlier, that study took place in 2017, and the trust I spoke to then told me they hadn't had a membership drive since the time of the buyout. When I spoke to them a few years later, I found that had changed. As a member of the trust, people have the opportunity to vote in elections to the land trust boards and stand for election and get involved in community consultations. The pandemic resulted in swift connections established with all residents on the estate. The more they knew their audience, the more the trust found out what they might need, whether it was a time of a crisis or just day to day. I was very struck by participants telling me that genuine poverty had been identified in some communities, with participants admitting they had no idea about the extent of it. But the strength of the networks through the land trusts have provided the foundation of their activities and the future development of responses to key issues like poverty. Although not in this diagram, social capital is very linked to human capital, and it does what it says in the tin, it's about people. And there's an increasing need for skilled people to support complex projects in community-owned estates, and this was raised quite a lot. And these kind of projects can be anything, but particularly include housing, which is critical for the sustainability of communities retaining and attracting population. The one capital which is often cited as a bit of a deal breaker for community-owned estates is financial capital, and it's maybe, but it's not a straightforward view. All trusts generate income to a certain extent. Some will be a small amount through croft rents, but for others it might be quite substantial through renewable energy projects. It's not a standard financial model for the trusts. One participant told me that financial viability remained their biggest challenge and their biggest worry. But another said that the trust was empowered to direct resources as the community required, however small these resources might be. The research also indicated something that might be a wee bit controversial, but that the pooling of financial resources among land trusts might be something to consider more going forward, not without its challenges. Although the pandemic temporarily halted tourism income, it was something that came through very strongly that if that was part of their DNA, then they would continue to do that, and rethinking it wasn't very much on their agenda. So just to conclude in some reflections from the research, which I thoroughly enjoyed doing, albeit remotely, and I would have loved to have been here in the Outer Hebrides while I was doing it. But the pandemic saw the land trusts here galvanised to support people in their communities, whether they were in the leading role or in a supporting role. The data indicated that their response was authentic, a community-based feel to it, which local people clearly trusting the trusts. So that was an important thing too. The trust clearly reached parts of their community for the first time, finding real poverty and real isolation. And the pandemic saw the need for ongoing services like prescription delivery and food banks. Resilience was also being demonstrated through the ability of results to trust to take on paid staff, which I mentioned earlier, 92 full-time, 6 seasonal workers. That's a lot of people, and it's the biggest single change in how estates have been run here. Given that the majority of people in the Outer Hebrides now live in community-owned estates, what they do matters and has the ability to reach a lot of people. The data did indicate that for some trusts, community ownership was a very good model for local development, but the study didn't suggest that that was the case for every area. Community land ownership has provided a mechanism to support appropriate and sustainable place-based development, something I know both David and Agnes will talk about shortly. So thank you for listening. There's much more information to be had, and like all good academic publications, they're all online, so you can click through that. There is an index, so you don't have to wade through all 75,000 words to find something of interest, and I hope you do. Thank you very much for your time.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. First of all, I'd just like to say thank you as well to the FRSE and UHI for the invitation to say a few words about communities here this afternoon. Rona mentioned resilience, and I hope what you are about to hear from my presentation, from Agnes's presentation, and it'll demonstrate that resilience and community land ownership go hand in hand. They are combined. In the Outer Hebrides here, we have the oldest, the biggest, and also some of the smallest multi-activity. And that's the first important word, multi-activity. It's a big difference when you've got, say, 10 projects on the go than if you've just bought a building with a one function. And the multi-activity ones are the ones that appear to be making a success of things. The 63% of the land is in that type of ownership in the Outer Hebrides. 70% of the population in the Outer Hebrides now live on that land. As Rona mentioned, there are 12 community groups, and they've been responsible, guaranteed, I can say it honestly, that they are responsible for successfully developing hundreds, if not into the thousands, of different projects for their communities. And there are definitely more future opportunities to come. In this short time we have, it's a reasonably short time, so you're really going to get a whistle-stop tour. And I'd like to go with you to look at the two Harris community landowners, the West Harris Trust and the North Harris Trust. The West Harris Trust, community owned now, it was what in the old days would have been called a daft's estate, scripted. It was owned by the Scottish Government. They weren't a bad landlord. They didn't stop anything happening, but they certainly didn't do anything. And as a result, it's a crofting estate. I should have said it's a crofting estate. There's 4 common grazings, 52 crofts. It includes most of the Harris Macher land, which in itself is a very unique commodity to the north and west of Scotland. The situation when they purchased it, can you see, is that legible at all? If not, I would like the lights out, please. If you don't mind, it's a bad colour on colour, is that possible? Otherwise you're going to have an afternoon of looking at blank pictures, which is not the best way of spending the afternoon. Better? Yeah. Right. The population in 2010 was 119. There was 1 child under the age of 5. And you can see there were no business opportunities, no business premises. There was no social rented housing, and there was no private rented housing. And it says dedicated community facility 0. In fact, they had 1 room in the old school that they could meet in every so often, but that was it. They started off by doing several, what might be called small developments, but they did them successfully without much money, and it built up a bit of momentum. Sorry, I go past. Okay. What they really wanted to do was to repopulate. They wanted the population to go up. Repeopling, if you like. We talk about rewilding a lot, but I think we should talk about repeopling, getting people back into these areas. The natural birth rate doesn't keep the population even staying the same. We need new people coming into these areas. The first aim, they had 4 aims when they set out. And the second slide will show you how they intended to do it. That the lighter coloured at the bottom there, it's a 7-acre site that had been taken out of Crofting tenure. And they were able to, it was actually handed back. They paid for it, but it was handed back to them. And that gave them land in which the trust themselves could build on. What they did was to put in, first of all, affordable housing. It's called Park Nishabost. You will see there, again, it's quite difficult to see. On that site, there are 4 affordable house plots sold for private builds. 10 properties built in partnership with the Hebridean Housing Partnership. And I think housing is key. People talk about jobs, and yes, jobs are important. But in many places just now, including all over Harris, the jobs are there, the houses aren't. And I think you'll find this same story right throughout the whole northwest of Scotland and certainly on the islands. Employment, jobs. The West Harris Trust itself employs 4. It's a 3.4 full-time equivalent. The building that you see there is the centre of that area, the 7 acres. There are 3 business units there. There's an office. There's a restaurant. If anybody feels like getting married, I guarantee it's one of the finest wedding venues in Scotland. And there is a restaurant. The restaurant used to be leased out, but now they've taken it back in-house to make it work more successfully. The West Highland Trust itself, apart from their staff in the restaurant, there's 8+ seasonal jobs. They have got, since 2010, 2012, they've actually got another 2 sites, and they now have 8 business units and 1 office spread over the 3 sites. And the other thing is all occupied. I've got a longer time than you might expect because it's been juggled round. So I'm going slower and I'm perhaps adding bits in regarding the whole area. We've got to put in facilities like business units that people can come into, because there are any businesses that are going, they're looking for sites for the cheapest they can get. And if we can put up something they can come into and welcome them in, it's more likely to be successful. Tourism. This particular slide shows that communities can react quickly. This is one of their 14 electric sites with 14 electric hookup sites. You've also got 5 camping spots. And the third bit of information there is probably the most important. From April to October, they're operating at 99% capacity. And obviously something like this particular site is beside the restaurant and beside the community centre. And it's obviously, it benefits that as well. So it's collecting and building something on top of something that's already there or something that you've created. It's a slow process, but if it's built steadily and slowly, it certainly works. The second aim they had was with renewable energy. A lot of communities have gone into renewable energy. They went into, there you go, 3 wind turbines, 158 kilowatt, a small hydro scheme. Now, one of the wind turbines and the hydro scheme have been sold since then. And again, flexibility that works within a trust. They will change their mind and they will do different things depending on the circumstances. But again, I think the most important point there is that 50% of the electricity from the turbine, you see the base of there, it is used to power the restaurant, the houses, and everything which is down the hill just over the end of the fence there. So, and over 50% of the electricity consumption on that site, Park Nishabost, is from the renewable sources. The third aim was to increase the understanding of our natural heritage. The word there is stunning natural heritage, and it is. It's, if anybody who's been down anywhere on the islands, really, they're quite magnificent. I've been born and brought up here, but I still find them quite magnificent, even on days like yesterday and today. But there they've got the Macherland, and it's to increase understanding. Land management comes into it. You've got to keep the place tidy. But they work with the John Muir Trust as well. And the John Muir Trust, working at ground level, is a very excellent organisation to be part of. They go into education, they go into schools, and they send work parties out to your area. I think the other things more or less speak for themselves. Visitor wardens. Harris gets a lot of visitors, probably more % than virtually any other island apart from Skye and Mull. But there are 2 visitor wardens now employed in the summertime. And their sole role is to go around and talk to people, help people, advise people, and just give a feeling of that you're welcome. And it works. The 4th aim, and this is what Rona was talking about as well, and I think Agnes will, so I won't go into your area too much, Agnes, but it's when I was in school in Harris, I knew more about the War of the Roses and Napoleon Bonaparte than I ever knew about island or Highland history and culture. And I think it's changing now, and it's not before time. But a lot of us don't know a lot of what's happening on the island. And the various ways the Trust went about it. They have community events, even during the winter time, winter months. You'll find 3 or 4 community events. And it's nearly all local people along then. And it's amazing what happens when you get particularly older people chatting. It's the amount of information in people's heads that is not written down anywhere. And modern social media doesn't help. Archive screenings, we all love looking at old photos, trying to recognise people. It says Cayley's in that as a point there. But every one of these community events and archive screenings tend to run into be a Cayley anyway. An archaeology trail. They're beginning to find things in West Harris that they didn't know were there. UIST has had a lot of archaeological work done, and obviously around Callanish. But West Harris has been left alone, and there's a lot of undisturbed work still to do. And finally, the Trust down there are doing a collaborative PhD with the UHI Centre for History and Sol Morostig. I think it's Mr. Robertson, isn't it? I think who's doing that. So what's all that done to West Harris since 2010? I hope you can see that clearly. I'll go through it line by line just in case you can't. But the population in 2010 was 119. Today it's 170. So when people talk about depopulation, please come and see what certain groups are able to do. And we're not alone. Colonsay, I just saw, are putting up 24 houses. Colonsay population is probably going to double. Under 5s, there was 1, now there's 7. The business spaces, there's now 8 business spaces. Social renting housing, there's now 6, plus 4 shared equity. The West Harris Trust dipped its toe into the water with shared equity in housing, and they're now occupied, so I'm going to assume that it's worked. Private renting housing has gone up to 4, and the dedicated community facility, they've got Talanamara, that bit in the centre, that is open to the community for many uses. I should have said there's also an exhibition centre in that as well for artists to have their painting up for a month. Future opportunities. At the moment, I spoke to the development manager down in West Harris who put this together with me, and in the future opportunities are more of the same. It works. More houses, more people, more businesses, more children. They want to additional camping hookups that are very, very good revenue source. I think that's about £20 a night now, and if you get 5, that's £100 every night, and it's full all summer. But what I think of all the points up there, the one that comes out to me again is the cruise market opportunities. Now, there's just a new deep water port just going to be opened in the next month or so in Stornoway. So the largest cruise liners will be able to come alongside, and instead of coming in small boats, people will be able to get off. That's going to benefit the islands if the islands are ready to take advantage of it. It's a lot of people, but this community group of 100, that was 119 people, are looking to see what opportunity they can make of this cruise and attract some down to that part of the island. I see you looking at the clock. Am I over running time now? I'm okay? You're doing grand. Thank you. Okay, even faster through North.
Stand in the way of North Harris.
I've been through the West Harris. I live in North Harris, and I think the first thing from that picture is that it's very different from West Harris. Most people look at a map of Harris and they'll see it all in the same colour and the same colour as Lewis. But here we have North Harris and West Harris, two adjacent communities, and yet totally different. Totally different in the way they're run, totally different what was there before, totally different in the way they're developing, although they cooperate on, for example, the hydro projects. But they are different. And the important thing is to let the people in that community make the decisions for their community. I wouldn't go down to West Harris and say, you've got to do this or got to do that. And they wouldn't come north and say the same in reverse. The community purchase of North Harris was in 2003. Its population was approximately 800, skewed as most populations. There's a higher percent of older people. Shortage of housing, shortage of jobs, same story everywhere. And that has the impact of having school closures and young people leave. The North Harris Trust, these are the developments since purchase. And again, having slightly more time, I'll take a wee while longer going through this than I originally intended. The variety of housing, 2 flats, 11 houses in partnership with the Housing Association, conversion of 2 houses on the island of Scalpay into family accommodation, and they also are providing sites. Employment again, 7 direct employees, a construction of 3 business units. There are 3 double units, so you could in fact get 6 businesses in there, but there's 3 in there just now who took over the double units. And I think that the next bit again I would draw your attention to, it's the encouragement of inward investors. It's all very well trusts do things, but you need partners, and if somebody is willing to come in and do things on their own private enterprise, welcome them in, try and get them in. The best example we've got is the new distillery in Tarbert. It's 30 people all the year round, well-paid work, and 40 people in the summertime. And it's really doing a terrific amount of good in the island. If you have 2 or 3 of these, think of how you could really change these communities. So inward investment is something I don't know if many people do. The Trust, to the best of my knowledge, have put no money in it, but what they did was they put out a welcoming hand. Environment is big. For those who know North Harris, environment is a big issue. It's a lot of land. It's 62,500 acres. A lot of it was in deer forest, and the people lived along the coast. So I'll just go through the words there. In the environment, the Trust look after deer. They're involved in the removal of invasive species. They constructed an eagle observatory, and believe it or not, for Harris, those who know it, when we were told for years trees won't grow, we now have a woodland interpretation centre. It's a nice walk, and it's a good interpretation centre. Increasing biodiversity, and I'll come back to that very quickly at the end, is also into these facilities for visitors. If you go out to the northwest to Hoosnish, there's a Macher interpretation centre. It's the one bit of Macher that's in North Harris, just a small area. It's most in West Harris. This is the only place in Hoosnish where there's Macher in North Harris. But in that area as well, so many people go down there. They've got camper van hookups and waste disposal in that area. I said originally that Community Land Trust can't do everything, and Harris already had a structure. It had Harris Voluntary Service, Harris Development Limited. And it's important these people work together and try not to stand on each other's toes. And on the social side, that's probably the side that the West Harris do a lot more of it, because they had nothing than North Harris. We've got a community hall, we've got lots of stuff. So the social for local and visitors, there's talks, walks, they work in the school and ranger service. 5 minutes? Thank you. Right, okay, we've looked at two and they've done things, and I think they've been successful both each in their own way. But how do you measure that? Because as community trusts, I was going to use the word plague, but I'm very aware there's people here who do research, I will always respond to our research, but we get asked to prove what we know over and over and over again. How do you prove you need housing? There's not a community house anywhere in Scotland that hasn't been filled immediately. So, looking at the bigger picture, what is a thriving community? A thriving community is one with families, youngsters, school roll. What do families need? Family needs affordable housing. They need a variety of employment. Oh, sorry, this has gone off. Thank you. They need a variety of employment. They need a decent environment to live in, and it needn't be a natural environment. It can be your neighbour. It could be a Christian environment, it could be a fishing environment, it could be a crofting environment, but you've got to get on with your neighbour. And finally, you've got to have a social life. You've got a good house, a good job. You like your neighbour, so you want something to do on a Friday night. But the way I always measure success, whether it's Colonsay or parts of Mull or Harris, generally, North Harris, the primary school rolls in Tarbert. 2014, that year was picked because that was the year that the present setup of schools, primary and secondaries, settled, and they've been the same since 2014. And you see they've gone up through the 70s, 80s, and now they're hitting the mid-90s. And that is success. Future planned opportunities for North Harris. There's a new business park being designed at the moment, a new 6-pitch camper van site that opened last week. In the Heritage, there's a place called the Whaling Station that you said you had your holiday opposite. It's got terrific potential, but it's going to cost a fortune. But it is part of the Harris Heritage, and they are working on it. Tarbert Gardening Project, it's one of these big Shetland polycrubs. It'll be partly used by locals if they want to grow things inside it, and the other bit will be a nursery. More EV charging points. There's more electric cars around all the time, including visitors chasing around trying to find where the nearest one is, so that trusts are reacting. This again is how they can react quickly. Further support for crofting activity. It's the first time crofts really have been mentioned here, and it's a big one, but I'm interested to hear what Frank's going to say about it tomorrow. And finally, the development of a 2,500 acres biodiversity. I'm going to skip the slide of the crofting slide because you're going to do that tomorrow. But if I can talk just for a moment about the 250,000 acres of biodiversity. Harris has been grossly overgrazed by both sheep and deer. SNH report, as it was then, said virtually all is overgrazed and the biodiversity pretty zilch. So there's a whole peninsula area of 2,500 and there's double electric deer fences in to stop the deer going into that. It was low populated deer anyway, but the deer that managed to get over the local stocking club now will take them out. And at the moment it's, better get my figures right, 50,000 trees have already been planted and they've got another 100,000 to go. And I mean, it would be lovely to live for another 50 years to see what it looks like at the end of that. So there you are, really. The picture leaving you with, that's North Harris, the hills in the distance, and that's West Harris, the beach at the bottom. If you want to delve any further into more information about these two trusts, these are their two websites, and you can, it's pretty pictures if nothing else. And my own DC community land at btinternet.com at the bottom, that's my own address, email address, and questions anytime, tomorrow, next week, next month, next year, whenever, and I will do my best to see if I can answer them. Thanks very much.
David, that was absolutely brilliant. Thank you so much. What we're going to do is we're going to have Agnes, and then we'll have a discussion of the three of you. Agnes, do you want to go now, or do you want us to? You're raring to go. Let's go. Okay, let's go, and then we'll have tea, coffee, and then we'll have a chat. Thank you. Agnes, can I just introduce you very briefly, if that's all right? Because Agnes is chair of the Galston Estate Trust. Galson, sorry, Frank told me, he did warn me. Was vice chair of the Community Land Scotland, managed the Gaelic publishing house Acare until 2022, was greatly honoured as the Gaelic ambassador at the 2020 National Mod for your dedicated promotion of Gaelic culture and pronunciation. And I've written here, you have an enviable reputation for speaking to a deep understanding of community ownership and enterprise. And I'm told that every word counts. So without any further ado, the Galson Community Trust, trials, tribulations, and success.
Thank you very much indeed, Des. I'm quite sure what to make of the reputation. I hope it's not too tough a reputation. But I do insist on losing that T in Galston. Otherwise, we'll end up in Ayrshire every time, and that is most certainly not where we want to be today. I wouldn't mind having the light on back up at this end, please, if that's possible. Thank you very much. That's an age thing. I can't help it, David. Rona is very much the young spirit of our trio today. So, how long do I have, Des? 15 minutes or thereabouts? About that. That's what I was working towards anyway. I don't have any pictures, so you can look at me and listen to me, or look out the window at the sunshine and listen to me at the same time. It's entirely up to you. I didn't come up with the title of this presentation, first of all, can I say. Trials, Tribulations and Successes. But once I got the email from Becky, I thought, that actually sounds reasonably melodramatic, and maybe, go on Carla, tick me off for the drama. That pretty well gives me license to go in any direction I want, and so I'll stick with the title and we'll go from there. I think between Rona's presentation and David's presentation, we've had a really nice introduction there into the big picture. And particularly David's back reference to the big picture in terms of the extent of ownership, community ownership in the Hebrides. I think it's really important to bear that in mind. So what I've tried to do is to look at a couple of vignettes that give you a flavour of what our community trust in Galson is, where it's come from, and where we see ourselves going. And throughout the presentation, I won't talk about Uras Gausing, Galson Estate Trust. I'll simply refer to the Uras. So whenever you hear the reference to the Uras, I'm in Galson. And I know that a couple of people went up and visited the Butt of Lewis this morning to get the full impact of a stormy northwest. And they will appreciate that it's not always a pretty picture, but sometimes it can be a really dramatic picture. And those of us here from the area look out on that most days. Where is Galson? Where is Galson Village? And where, for this purpose, is Galson Estate Trust? We are a big wedge of moorland in the northwest of Lewis, which extends from about the middle of the moorland area right across to the Atlantic coast. And it's along the Atlantic coast that you'll find the villages where pretty well everybody lives. So where did this happen? The Ura story starts like many other trust stories. 17 years ago, this year, we took formal ownership of the land. 19 years ago, the trust was actually formally set up. And it's been over 20 years since the steering group was first established. So it's a long journey. And that we share with nearly every group that I know that's gone down this road. There are no shortcuts. and neither should there be shortcuts. And I think we'd all agree that the massive inconsistency that is still around today is if you have enough money in your pocket, as a private individual, it doesn't matter where you come from in this big wide world, you can come to Scotland tomorrow and buy as many thousands as you want, as many thousand acres as you want for as many £1,000 as you're able to afford, and nobody will ask you what you're going to do with it. There is no public interest test at the moment, whereas we, the community and community groups, will be asked and challenged at every turn. But we can come back to that later when we have questions. Now, often the impetus for community ownership resulted from a vexatious relationship with a private landowner. This was not the case in Galson at all. In fact, very, very few people even knew who their landowner was, and certainly crofters for the most part, the only relationship they had with that landowner was once a year paying the rent. So, passive is the word that I've always used to describe the relationship that we have. Wasn't a bad one, wasn't a good one, it was a non-relationship. It was a passive relationship, really. And I think it was when we then started to see what other areas that we could identify with, Assynt, first of all, places like the island of Egg, and much closer to home, North Harris, that a feeling started to arise, well, we could do something. We could actually probably manage to do something in our own area which would be at least as good, if not better. Thank you, David. And so from there, a small group came together. And I think it's also really important to recognise that following the purchase in Assynt, the setting up of the community land unit as part of HIE was a really, really important tool in that landscape that existed for communities like ours to be able to move forward. And when the going got tough, it was conversations with other land trusts and a straight line towards the people who worked with community land unit. That was really, really important. Has to be said too that at that time, as we moved forward, the support that we got in a practical way from the local authority here in the islands was very important too. And that was especially in terms of things like mapping, which, you know, it was a big, big burden on communities to be able to respond to these things, which we could have never have done on our own as a small community group. So, on the 12th of January 2007, the old New Year's Day in Scotland, that was chosen as our day of celebration and the day to formally mark the passing of the ownership of the land from the private landowner to the care of the community for the benefit of ourselves and future generations. Gausing, as I said earlier, is a large tract of moorland, 56,000 acres, quite sizable, 22 crofting townships along the Atlantic coast, and within these crofting townships, around 600 crofts. At that time, approximately 2,000 of our population, and in fact, it hasn't dropped hugely since then. What has changed is the demographic profile, and like many, many other communities across the islands, the balance between older and younger members of the population is a bit skew-with the wrong way. So that is, was, and continues to be one of our main focus of I guess, activity and interest. The other thing that's important to note is that of these 56,000 acres, it was all under crofting tenure. There were no staff, no buildings, nothing. So what we took on at that time was just the land, a really important asset. The need for a significant income source was urgent, as we never could afford staff if we were just going to rely on croft rents and some small rentals. We couldn't rely on volunteers constantly. So this challenge was taken up by the board with the help of our very first employee, a very part-time administrator, who's still with us today as our finance manager. And we're very pleased that that is the kind of relationship that we have with our staff. Our first manager was not appointed until we had been operating for over 2 years. And whilst I wouldn't recommend that as a prerequisite, there's no doubt that if there are board members with the right skill set, such a close involvement in the early days gave us an understanding that serves us well to this day in terms of governance and the day-to-day running of the organisation. Lots of things were looked at, but from the outset, renewable energy was identified as a potential project that could deliver income at scale. The rewards could be enormous, but the risks were enormous as well. And the first step taken was to set up an arm's-length company to take the renewables project forward and ensure that the land trust, the heart of our organisation, would always be protected. I remember the early discussions, both at board level and out in the community, and the enormity of the sums involved. But we were agreed that without revenue, we were going to be forever constrained by the priorities of funders. These would not always coincide with our ambitions for our community, and so the board agreed the risks were worth taking. Turbine 1 was financed with a combination of grants and bank borrowing and started generating in 2013. Very soon afterwards, we started working to deliver Turbine 2 and Turbine 3. And these were financed with bank borrowing and, importantly, over £700,000 which were raised through community shares. I'm being really careful with these figures because there are experts from Urasauergausing sitting in front of me today who I know will correct me if I get these things wrong. But please do it, don't hold back. These £700,000 raised through community shares were not just important in terms of the money raised. It was the fact that that became money which we did not have to answer for to another organisation. They were money that we could begin to use quickly to get the next stage of this project on the move. They were also, we felt, a reflection of where people saw us as an organisation and the trust they were prepared to put in our being able to deliver this huge project. So, we hear much about community wealth building. This was our road. This was our key towards community wealth building. Community wealth building is not just about the scale of income generated, but rather the creation of income that is then invested back into the community for the benefit of the wider community. In 2015, following months of community consultation, the URAS published an ambitious 20-year strategic plan to provide a transparent set of priorities and a measurable portfolio of targets against each of these priorities. Now, I've got one or two of copies of the most recent iteration of that plan with me, but they're available online if anybody should wish one. Throughout the process, community land ownership has been the catalyst. If we at Urasauergausing didn't own the land for the community, then we couldn't consider doing the things we're doing, at least not in the same way. The fact that we not only have developed the project, but also own the land for the community, it makes it a completely different ball game. The community is answerable to the community. And that is the most important thing of all. So, the shared vision of the URAS, and only the URAS, has been the motivator behind all of this. One of the questions often asked of us as community landowners is, how do you manage? A second question is often, how long can this last? How do we manage what exactly, is often our reply. And how long can what last? The reply to the second question. Because why should we even have to consider that? But then again, take a step back, and probably it's not an unreasonable question. And at the end of the day, these are questions we ask ourselves, because only by continually reassessing what we're doing, examining what we're doing, and measuring what we're doing, can we be assured that we're doing what the community wants and that we're doing something that is sustainable. Now, sustainability and resilience are words we've heard already this afternoon. I think it's fair to say that since 2019, at Urasaurach Housing, we've had our fair share of challenges that have tested our resilience. Starting with a devastating fire in February 2019 that completely destroyed our business centre, but thankfully happening during the night, nobody was hurt. Followed immediately afterwards, in the following year, in 2020, by COVID-19, already touched on today. Then, later in 2020, the undersea cable break that meant all renewable generation stopped for a year, and yes, all income from that stopped as well. And that was the case until a year later, the cable was replaced. And most recently, the cost of living crisis that affected everyone, but especially the most vulnerable in our communities. Back to the fire. By the time the fire occurred, the staff team at the Uras had grown considerably. And it was to their credit that the work of the Uras continued almost without interruption once a temporary new staff base was identified. By the time COVID-19 struck, a community-based organisation which was able to respond quickly, fleet of foot, and to identify the needs of the community was really, really important. And working with others in the community, many of them volunteers, the title of anchor organisation was not one we had sought, but working alongside others in the community, it was one we were proud to be given. The cable break was a very different test. And without a regular income, we had to freeze the Community Investment Fund, which was one of the key tenets of turning the money back into the community. However, a prudent reserves policy allowed work to continue, and no staff had to be paid off. Fortunately, the cable had been repaired and finances were in a reassuring position when the cost of living crisis hit. The immediate instinct was to start paying out money, but we've always regarded the wind revenue as something to be managed with care and not to be squandered. This, not surprisingly, occasionally leads to complaints and criticism that we're a bit tight with our money. We're a bit reluctant to spend. But ultimately, we feel that most people understand that we have a duty to manage this hard-earned income wisely. And in the situation of the cost of living crisis, we took advice from health professionals, carers, and teachers, amongst others, as to where they saw the greatest need. The annual report published in the autumn of last year, and again, I've got some copies of that with me, but others are available online. The annual report published in the autumn of last year details a raft of initiatives targeted at the most vulnerable in the community and shows that some £74,000 of URA's funding was spent through a specially set up hardship fund. These went directly to the people who needed it most. And some of these initiatives are still ongoing because we felt it wouldn't be right in any way to walk away from them. Back to the strategic plan. And as David illustrated with his references to West Harris and North Harris, we also have a number of priority areas, and these are detailed in the plan. These fall into 4 specific areas: health and well-being, tourism, crofting and land use, and exceptional place. These all include a number of cross-cutting themes, including, importantly, our language and culture, and our crofting heritage, which are reflected in many of our activities and are considered at the core of who we are as a community, both as we look behind us, look at where we've come from, and absolutely going forwards. In the recent 5-year update, each priority is assessed on targets achieved and the measures used to assess that, and importantly, a revised set of actions and the expected benefits as we go forward. There are, of course, challenges. There's no point in pretending we live in some kind of utopia and that the organisation is respected, not by everyone, of course, wanted, never was, it still isn't by some. There are those who will close their eyes to what has been achieved, and fair enough, as long as you can offer something better in its place, but we're still waiting for that. At least I haven't heard it. Maybe it is there. There are, of course, alternatives for doing things, and we must always listen to these. So just a few of the challenges that I see, and this is not something that we've agreed, particularly as an organisation, that we should never lose sight of the reason for being. We should never lose sight of what actually led to the setting up of the Community Land Trust. And that we use our land and our hard-earned resources with care. That we recognise the importance of creating good partnerships. Again, something that's already been referred to several times today. Not any of the land trusts that I know could do much of what we do by ourselves as an organisation. We rely on working with others in the community. We have key partners in our own community, ranging from Cuminiatri Nish, our heritage organisation, which has been now in existence for over 40 years, some of our sports organisations, our health organisations, and some of our community centres, and others. These are important partners, but we also have to look beyond the boundaries of our own community, so we need to have partners beyond that. And we're very, very conscious of the need to work with the local authority, with environmental organisations, and so on. There are challenges. The need for affordable housing, again touched on today and shared with many, many other areas. The need to assess repopulation and many, many other things. But these in particular need to be acted on and need to see outcomes. Being ready to respond to new opportunities when they occur. We heard mention from David about the extended opportunities that may be afforded to us through tourism with the new cruise ship visits. And so already we've begun to put some things in place which will allow the community to benefit from that. And looking forward to the next few years, we need to be mindful of the need to refresh the board and always be aware of what our responsibilities are. I think what I've described to you will reassure you and will show you evidence of what we have been able to do. But we wouldn't, the board as a trust could not do any of these things without the staff team that we have. I told you at the very beginning, there were no employees. Today there are 14 and 2 other posts being advertised for as we speak. One of those is an apprentice, a 2-year apprentice, just complete, coming into the final months of her community development apprenticeship. We think that is hugely important, and there is room for more of that. I also want to mention the community land family across Scotland, but particularly here in the islands, because the interrelationship between ourselves and other trusts is hugely important, and there is much to be done there. Community Land Outer Hebrides was set up to create a mechanism to share experience and to learn with each other. And Community Land Scotland exists and has existed for some years now, set up by the members who are the community landowners to do the same thing across Scotland. And while money is not everything, we should never underestimate the importance of a regular income stream. In our case, this has given us independence to set our priorities for our community with our community, confidence to sit at any table as an equal player, and resilience to plan ahead. In closing, I just want to mention one thing. I've mentioned already how our community was inspired at the outset by what happened in other communities similar to ourselves, and how together with land reform legislation and the guiding hand of the Community Land Unit when needed, that really saw us through some very difficult negotiations. Situation at the moment is rather different, and it's hard for me to see how a community like ourselves, if they wanted to progress a community land buyout of scale, how in fact they could do it. The situation is very different as we look across the landscape, literally the landscape. 17 years ago, people would have looked at the moorland of North Lewis, which is now Urusauroch Housing, and would have seen a large peat bog of not much value, as most people would have seen it. Today, looking through a slightly different prism, the prism that leads to carbon credits with pounds value, biodiversity credits with pounds value, this new concept of rewilding, which comes with new values and very few people. Suddenly, that same land, not necessarily here in Lewis, but certainly as a generality across Scotland, has got huge value. The benefits to the human population and the environment from community land ownership have been well described to you here. But with dwindling financial investment, legislation that is no longer fit for purpose, and more land than ever being sold under the radar as rich men's playgrounds, we need government to take a lead. Thank you.
That was brilliant. Thank you. All three presentations, brilliant. What I propose we do is break for tea and coffee now, and then we come back and have a short discussion before we get into the next presentations. But please, before we adjourn for tea and coffee, please join me in thanking all our speakers. For those online, we will return at 3:10. We'll resume at 3:10. Thank you very much.
Toilets are up there, toilets are on the corner.
just for the audience, we've just amended the timetable slightly, so we will return at 15:20 for Q&A of the previous speakers, and then at 15:30 we'll have Faye MacLeod join us. Okay, so look forward to seeing you all shortly. Thank you. Good to go? Welcome back, everyone. And, no. It's a good job it's a friendly audience here. Is it all right? Let's get on. Try again.
It's obviously online.
Testing,
but
testing.
No, I don't think that'll affect it. Might give me a sip.
Apologies if you can hear us online, but we are now here. So we're going to have about 5 to 10 minutes of Q&A on the last 3 excellent presentations, and then Faye MacLeod will join us at 3:30. So, any questions?
Good, nothing. Right.
Yeah. Microphone. Yeah, we need a microphone front. Do you want to just shout? Oh, actually, front, we will
Probably not
here for the online.
Here it comes. Here it comes.
Oh God, one of you take this, whatever it is.
This is primarily for David. The other two can stand down.
Make it a short one, please.
Yeah. Can you hear me? Yeah. So it begins with a statement. I'd like to see here how you respond to it, because the idea of the provision of business units and whatnot is not new. HIB did this 45 years ago. The problem with HIDB and HIE, I have to say, is that they charged the floor space rental, according to the district valuer, from Inverness prices. So nobody could afford to use them. So a lot of these places were built and never used, never filled, or if they did, they were there in and out again. How did you actually attract people to use those premises, to make them affordable, to make them accessible?
Reasonably straightforward, because it all depends on what financial support you're going to get from outside. And I agree with you, HIDB then put up loads of these all over the place, and the rent was far too high. We had the same problem in North Harris. But once a community is in a position to raise the money from various sources, it doesn't leave a lot of loan to finance. And so the rents in these new buildings, I wouldn't say they're the cheapest, but they're certainly nowhere near the level that HIDB would have charged even 20 years ago.
Any other questions? Yes.
My question's for David too. David, you mentioned multi-activity being really important at the beginning. That reminded me way back of multifunctional community cooperatives. The Cahoman movement started by the HIDB. Well, it was the Cahoman movement here. How much do you think it is the years of kind of practicing at that helped our communities with community land ownership?
A lot. I remember, again, going back all these...
I expect a longer answer.
I remember going to the Cover Free Hotel just along the road here and listening to Agnes. She was speaking at me. I didn't know her very well at that time. And she said, if the Cahoman fails, I can't see anywhere else we can go. And sadly, a fair number of the Cahomans have failed. One still exists in Harris, mainly because it's a shop, and it's the best shop in Harris and the only shop there is in the south end of the island. I think the difference is with multi-activity, you're going to should get multi-income streams, whereas some of the Cahomans didn't really have enough variety to make them financially sustainable. And I think the things, looking at the broader picture, community landowners have done something different. They've replaced what was missing, and what was missing were 2 C's, capital and confidence. And community landowners have put that back into the area. So yes, we learned from the co-op, we learned from Harris Development Limited, we learned from a load of organisations that already existed in Harris. But the difference is the community land trusts have got money. They can be the first brick in the wall instead of the last.
I think there's one other thing too, Carla, and you know this too, that instead of being told to have 5 activities, any community land trust that has 5 activities or 7 activities or 27 activities are pursuing these activities because they want to and they see that they have a purpose, not because they've been instructed And this goes back to what I mentioned earlier in terms of the independence that an income stream at your own hand gives you, as you just said, David.
I have a question for you, Rona, and it's something you mentioned the word poverty. In fact, you mentioned poverty several times. How do we know when there's poverty in the community, and how then do we identify what we need to do about it? I was then going to put that to you, Agnes, from a community perspective.
I think it was one of the maybe a surprise for people that I was speaking to, they found it surprising, but they found it because of the times that people were living in, because they needed to be connected, and realizing how much people were struggling to do the basic things. That's why the food banks emerged, and the questions arose about how do we do this ongoing. And Agnes alluded to the fact that projects that were started at that time are ongoing, and they're not necessarily in relation to poverty, but they're in relation to how people's lives are as well, and having a full and rounded life. But by engaging through the pandemic, that's what came through, that there were people out there struggling. And since I conducted the research, we entered this time of the cost of living crisis, and I suspect that maybe people are even struggling even more, but might be better placed for help, having reached out into the community, or more, the community came to them.
So, Agnes, is poverty has this been an issue that you've encountered in setting up Galson and as it's going forward?
Well, I'm glad you structured that question in two parts, because poverty per se would probably not have been something that we would have identified in that way 17 years ago. But does poverty exist in our area? Absolutely it does. And as Rona mentioned there, I think it's not entirely probably surprising that it was the pandemic, and immediately after that, the cost of living crisis, that brought a lot of that into sharp focus. And for an organisation like ourselves, a community trust that's in the community, there was a need to respond. And it's when you start going out and responding that some of these things become even clearer. And I think the other thing significantly is one of the things we wanted to do was not to stigmatise. So we've been very, very careful in terms of some of the initiatives that have been taking place, that it's not about children from certain families. It's available to all children across the community. And I think that has made it acceptable. That has made many of our initiatives acceptable. We also made sure that if people didn't want to take advantage of some of the initiatives, they could either return money or return things that were provided to them, and they could do that discreetly.
Well, thank you. Yeah, a couple of questions. So I'll go to David first. I'll go to Neil first. David, the microphone's close to you. Go David first. I couldn't see the microphone. My eyesight's appalling.
Okay, this is really a question about the income that comes into not all of the community trusts, but a lot of them, and what seems to me a kind of expectation by cash-strapped other authorities, particularly local authorities, but maybe health boards and others as well, that those well-off communities will start to deliver services which are really statutory obligations of other bodies, and then your added value diminishes because you're providing somebody else's service. Is that an issue for Galson or for anybody else?
Yeah. It's a national issue. It's apparent even in urban areas. It's something that Community Land Scotland warn communities against when they are introduced to them, is that make absolutely sure to the nth degree that if you're asked to take on something, make sure that it checks out commercially. And I think underline the point that community landowners, they're about people, but they've got to be commercially minded. There's no way around it. They have to be, otherwise they would die. And so far, no community landowner in Scotland has gone upside down.
I'm going to go for the two hands at the back. Neil.
Just wanted to briefly return to the theme of poverty. So I think, as you mentioned when you introduced me, I'm, as well as my UHI role, I have a role in the Kyle of Sutherland Development Trust. There's no involvement in the Kyle of Sutherland Development Trust in land, but we are a community development trust. I live in the Kyle of Sutherland. And one of the key issues in our community that is hugely, I suppose, visible in a way that it didn't used to be is the extent of poverty. And we've adopted similar strategies. So our community larder is available to everybody. It's not just sort of restricted or anything like that. But I suppose the question I've got is, what are collectively perhaps your reflections around, as a community, the way out of poverty, given the fact that, certainly in our experience, poverty is potentially really destabilizing in terms of population. So just wondered if you got any thoughts about that.
I wish I had an answer for that one, Neil, I really do. I think our experience when the cost of living crisis hit and trying to work a way through that, which would reach the people who needed to be reached in a way that would be socially acceptable and in a way that we could afford. Let's face it, there'd be no point in doing anything if it was actually going to drain the organisation, was to take advice from those who understand the population and the vulnerable in the population best. I don't think any of the things we learned through that process has meant, and correct me if I'm wrong from others from others out of Galson who are with us today, but I think what our priority areas in addressing housing, in trying to address employment, in trying to address the creation of wealth in one way or another, and access to employment and income as being the priorities, are the only ways that we can sensibly begin to address these other things. Of course, we're looking at food growing within the community and access to food and encouraging people to grow their own food, but these are not immediate. The cost of electricity within the area, how do you work with people who live in almost slum accommodation to look at how they might improve their housing? You can't force people to do that. So it's a real tightrope that you're walking in that, even in a small community. Do you want David?
Yeah. Just agree with Agnes, it's a very difficult question to answer, and I think it'll be different in different communities. I know in Harris, I spoke earlier about how there being already existing community groups on the ground, and there's one called Harris Voluntary Service. I think they're just celebrating something. It's in the decades they've been running anyway, and the social, that side of it will tend to be dealt with by Harris VS. The Trust and HVS, HDL, all the Harris organisations meet every so often under what they call the Harris Forum, which was initiated by people in the Trust to try and get all the various organisations to talk together. And Kenny, the person behind you, speak to him afterwards and he'll tell you about it. But it works well, because that's where discussions in areas outside the direct remit of the Trust or HDL or Harris Voluntary Service are discussed across the various organisations and the best solutions found for the area.
I think the only thing I would add is the point that was made about service delivery. It's a really important one. There has to be an equity of service delivery across communities and an expectation that that level of service will continue, and not to put pressure under communities to take on services that need to be available to all. And it's a genuine point of debate, and it certainly was concern that was raised with me during that time.
Excellent. Please join me. Oh, all right, you've got one question. Quickie. Yeah, this is great.
I'd like to thank all the speakers for their inspiring talks. Could I ask Rona a question? Maybe the other speakers would contribute as well if they want to. You mentioned in your study, and obviously was a part of your doctorate, the Gaelic issue in the islands and how it relates to land trusts. The question I would have is, how can the land trust approach to Gaelic affairs help move beyond the symbolic adherence to Gaelic development towards an actual practical empowerment of the disfavoured minority?
So that's a really straightforward question. I think the answer to that is about what is a sustainable community. And what people were saying to me was you need the enabling infrastructure. It's quite a clumsy term, but what that means is that you need the housing, you need the places to meet, you need local people to give them the chance to stay within their communities, and that is a real struggle. The places where Gaelic would be spoken naturally. I use the word naturally, it's maybe not the right word, but just people to feel comfortable if Gaelic has been in their family but they've not been using it as much, and people said that to me, they'd got out of the way of speaking the language as well. I think it's very difficult to be prescriptive about retaining a language and expanding the reach of a language, but one of the ways that's to me, it seems, is the bits round about it that helps sustain the community and that Indigenous population, for which Gaelic means all sorts of things. It means communication, but it means culture, it means history. And it's about what Gaelic means now and into the future through these communities. Agnes, I don't know if you've got anything else?
Agnes, do you want to comment?
No, I think probably Crawford and I could talk about this for a while, but I'm just intrigued by your use of the word symbolic, and I think I know what you mean by that. So, is the fact that we're called Dúras Ára Gowsing, is that the only thing we do as far as Gaelic is concerned? It's not. Our name is Dúras Ára Gowsing, and the translation of that is Galson Estate Trust, and that's how it's used. What else do we do for by that? Well, you know, the Gaelic is very much part of the language of the community. It is no longer the language of the community that I grew up in extent, but that is where it is. So how you begin to engage with that in a way that people will engage with you in a positive way is the real challenge, I think, at the moment. And unfortunately, the recent announcement of withdrawal of funding for development officers across the Highlands and Islands is not helpful. In fact, across Scotland, was the funding that was withdrawn. So we need to find, in our own case, we decided not to go down the road eventually of Common Gaelic funding. Instead, we've normalised initiatives that we were doing within our work structure, within our team. And we don't have a Gaelic officer, because that actually sets it apart. And I was happy to go down that road. Sorry.
No, not at all. Thank you very much. Please join me in thanking our three speakers. That was brilliant. Incidentally, I think that last question probably begs a PhD, but we may not even have enough time to complete the PhD on it, given its importance. Now, I'm delighted to see we've got Faye on screen here. Greetings, Faye. Apologies for keeping you a wee while, but we've had a great discussion. If I could just introduce Faye, we're absolutely delighted to have you joining us virtually. I'm so sorry you've had a difficult day in flights, flying over the sea and the Isles, but it's terrific to see you. Faye runs an accountancy practice in the Isle of Skye. She's highly experienced in the charities and communities sector. She co-founded the excellent Skye Wind website as a centralised information resource for islanders, describing the many opportunities of wind energy. And I was looking at the website this morning, and if you do look for it, it's Skye Wind in uppercase, 2 words. And recently, Faye has written a lot about the challenges ahead of the Highlands and Islands economy, indeed part of what we've just been discussing. So over to Faye to give us a talk on the perspectives on wind energy opportunities. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. And I'm very sorry that I'm not in Stornoway. I circled around above Stornoway for about an hour before heading back to Edinburgh. So I'm very sorry not to be there in person, but glad to have got back on the ground in time to join and hopefully tell you a little bit about Skye Wind and a little bit about some of the information that we're sharing through the website and some of the engagement we've had with a number of different organisations since then. So I'm going to share screen and hopefully you will be able to see my slides there. I'm sure you'll tell me if that's not working. Okay, so just start telling you a little bit about Skye Wind. It was set up last year as a website because there was a sense that there was a lack of information giving the bigger picture and collecting data that didn't just give tidbits and snapshots of little bits of projects, but actually trying to give the cumulative impact of what's being proposed on Skye. So, I mean, I've been very fortunate to live and work in the islands for the last 20 years. And over the last 17 years, have had some involvement with community wind energy, preparing business plans, feasibility studies, and also the accounting for that once it's up and running. And that's really my very amateurish knowledge of the energy market is purely to do with being involved from the financial side in community energy. So set up just to see how it would go, a public meeting in Portree in February 2023. At this point, there was snippets coming out in the press around potential proposals for wind projects on Skye. So in February, we set up a meeting, had representatives from Local Energy Scotland, John Muir Trust, and a few other kind of interested people that we thought might be useful for people to hear from. That went very well and was well received, and people wanted more information. So we had another couple of public meetings and then decided we'd try and collate the data and try and pull together a website. Now, on the website, if you look at it, it's very much drawing on my own experience of what's happened in the Western Isles with wind turbines and the very successful wind projects that have happened in the Western Isles, particularly from a community perspective. One of the other aspects that we've shown on the Skye Wind website is a concept around Skye energy. Can we do it differently? Does it have to be externally developer-led projects, or can we do something that's much more locally based? And we've had a number of contributors provide data and information. And quite interestingly, we've been contacted by, in particular, the Shetland News, and they have shared with us a lot of information around the Viking energy project that's happened in Shetland over the last number of years. And quite interestingly, just recently, the council in Shetland have come out and seem to be moving away from onshore wind. The success that they had with a wealth fund from the oil has not been replicated in terms of onshore wind. And they seem to have changed the policy and the strategy that they're now taking with onshore wind, recognising that it hasn't delivered a huge amount of benefit for the communities relative to what's being extracted in terms of wealth and energy from the islands. So this is a computer-generated image of part of what's coming to Skye if the proposals are followed through. So we're looking at potentially a huge number of turbines of a scale that's more than double the size of the turbines at the moment that are going to be on the island. And my interest when the proposal started coming out was, well, what's the community going to get from this? What are the benefits and what are the impacts going to be? And unfortunately, when I started looking into what the benefits were going to be, they were relatively small. and in particular in comparison to what's gone on in the Western Isles, looking at the very, very successful community projects that have been delivered. So the contrast is quite stark, and this is essentially what I've been presenting in terms of providing information around giving the contrast so that people can stop and think about actually, are the proposals for Skye really going to deliver community benefit? And if not, can we influence that? Can we change that and give much better benefits back to the community? So I've mentioned that this is just a snapshot of what's coming to Skye. It's not all of it. But there are existing wind farms on Skye. We've got 2 near Edinburgh, and Edinburgh's the village that you're seeing at the head of the loch here, just at the bottom of the screen. So there's 2 existing projects in that area, and they deliver 69 megawatts of energy, or there's 69 megawatts of installed capacity across those 2 sites. And I'm in particular going to highlight one of them. So this is the smaller of the 2, Ben Aketil wind farm. So Ben Aketil is a 12 turbine wind farm. It's got an installed capacity at the moment of 7.6 megawatts. And over the last 15 years, fortunately, the accounts for this particular wind farm are publicly available because they've set up one company for this particular project. It's not often that easy to get that level of data and detail from commercial businesses, but because this has been set up as one project, one company, I've been able to extract the data for the last 15 years. So in the case of Ben Aketil, the turnover has been 128.8 million over the 15 years. The profits extracted from that have been 55.5, and the tiny little sliver that you see at the top in grey is the donations that have gone back into the community. So this is sort of helpful in terms of giving the scale of what's being extracted versus what's going back into the community. In the case of Ben Aketil, if you follow the trail of who owns Ben Aketil and you follow the trail of companies, you'll discover that its ultimate parent company is actually a Cayman Islands owned investment company. So on Skye, our wind is generating lots of profits for, in the case of Ben Aketil, a Cayman Islands based company, and in the case of Edinburgh Estate Wind Farm, it's owned by Vattenfall. So again, 100% of our wind farms on Skye at the moment are owned by foreign-owned entities. Looking at Ben Aketil, the promise that was made to the community was £3,000 per megawatt. That would have given us a payout of 1.2 million. But as I've shown in the previous slide, we actually only received 658,000. So we've got a shortfall of 542,000. And I think what we have to remember is that at the moment, the externally developed projects, they make promises, but there's no legal backing. There's no legal contract in place that says the community has to receive this funding. So it's just simply whether they want to pay that. And in this case, for whatever reason, it's significantly less than what was promised to the community to begin with. Now, this isn't just the case on Skye. There's a SOSE report that was published in the last couple of months, which demonstrates that in the south of Scotland, it's the same situation. The amount that's being paid out is well short of the £5,000 per megawatt that's currently guidance from the Scottish Government. It's also worth mentioning that that £5,000 was established about more than 10 years ago now, and it hasn't increased. But obviously we know that inflation has increased the value of the pound. So therefore, you know, there's got to be questions asked about why are we still paying out or suggesting guidance that £5,000 per megawatt that was set up 12 years ago, and why isn't all of this being index linked? So turning to the Western Isles, and I'm just going to summarise this very, very quickly in one slide. Now, I hope Agnes, one of our previous speakers, doesn't take offence that I haven't included the Galson turbine here. This is based on the 3 projects that I'm very familiar with in North Uist, South Uist and Barra, plus I've added in the Point and Sandwick project up in Lewis there. So this isn't by all means the full picture of community-owned turbines in the Western Isles, but these are 4 fairly sizable projects that I'm familiar with. In total, there's 9 turbines with 18.6 megawatts of installed capacity. Those 4 projects alone deliver 2.2 million per annum to the community. Now, that's a very sizable amount and a very significant sum for relatively small communities that could really, in many cases, be described as transformational in terms of what that can deliver. Not just what it can deliver in terms of pounds and pence, but also the confidence that it gives the communities to be able to move forward with projects, because they're generating their own income. They're then using that money to deliver services and new projects and making a massive difference to the areas where they are. So we can see that there's a massive contrast between what's happening in Skye in terms of the external, usually foreign-owned, developer-led projects versus the community projects. There's a massive difference in terms of the scale, and we're not necessarily thinking that we can replicate what the Western Isles already has, because technology's moved on, the height of turbines has moved on. But what we need to do is we need to make sure that our communities are represented and that they're actually receiving a fair deal out of what's going on. So what we also have to kind of remember is that this is all about wind generation, but we also have to question how that links into wind transmission. And there's a big disconnect at the moment. We have a lot of external developers looking to generate wind, but at the moment, the infrastructure isn't there to actually capitalise on that in the transmission system. And this is kind of a national infrastructure problem. But it then means that when we hear things like wind development is going to deliver net zero, well, actually, it's not going to deliver net zero unless we can sort out the transmission system. And at the moment, the transmission system doesn't meet the level of generation that's already planned for Scotland. So wind generation targets are all very well, but actually if that wind isn't going anywhere other than to generate profits for external developers, then we really need to question from an environmental perspective, what's the point if we're not actually going to capitalise on what's being generated. What does get generated is significant profits for developers who we have to also remember when there's too much wind blowing will actually be paid to switch off the power. And again, you know, are there ways that we can capitalise on that and look to benefit our communities by using wind in a different way? So I'm not going to run through all of the detail on here. And these slides will be available if anybody wants them afterwards. But there's quite a lot of things to think about in terms of the national infrastructure and what the situation is. But also, when we look at somewhere like Skye, we've got 9 different projects potentially on the cards at the moment, 9 different wind developers coming to deliver projects, all offering different levels of community benefit. It's complicated, it requires multiple community trusts, and there are winners and losers across the island. Community groups themselves have been considering how they can deliver community-owned wind turbines. However, the message that's coming back to them is that landowners have agreed exclusivity agreements with wind developers, and therefore the door isn't open to communities to get on board and be part of that. We've also got a challenge from the public sector funding at the moment, in that some of the funding that was available in the past that the Western Isles organisations were able to benefit from in terms of development officer funding, that's not now available, or certainly it's not available across the Highlands. There's a number of things that we have learnt in recent times. Firstly, that the national grid capacity expansion just isn't enough to meet the wind development ambition in Scotland. And again, at the moment, a lot of what's coming in the direction of islanders, in particular from a community aspect, is the community consultations and benefits are very tokenistic, and it's a nice thing to say that your project is going to benefit the communities, but we really have to question, is that being delivered? A lot of the community consultations don't necessarily give us the full picture. We only really get that when the planning applications go in, and then we've got a ticking clock, as we only have a limited amount of time to consider the projects. £5,000 per megawatt of community benefit was recently described by a Highland councillor as beads for the natives. And that's very accurate. And that's if you can even get to your £5,000 per megawatt of community benefit from the wind developers. Community benefit is a voluntary arrangement. There's no contractual or legal standing in any of that. Limited geographical areas get the community benefit, and it's very divisive in island communities. Community shares are often offered, but they're very limited in terms of what that really means, and being able to access that's quite limited. And there's also an excellent report, which I'm sure a lot of you may already have seen before, that was commissioned by the Point and Sandwick Trust, which demonstrates that community-owned renewable projects deliver 34 times the return to local communities that externally developer-led ones do. There are potential solutions, but it takes a lot. It's going to take a lot of effort and a lot of change at government level as well, to allow a lot of these developments to really be meaningful for our communities. So there's a few solutions popped up there on the slide, coming out of some of the discussions that we've had with a number of different organisations and individuals over the last year. And you may also be aware that in the last couple of weeks, there's a very timely call to action to the Scottish Government for a fair energy deal being called for. And this is a collaboration between Community Land Scotland, Community Energy Scotland, DTAS, Scottish Community Alliance, and Scottish Community Finance. And there are 7 calls for action in there to accelerate growth in community energy, set a wholly owned community energy target of 1 gigawatt by 2030, to address some of the challenges that exist in repowering some of the existing wind farms when they come for being at the end of their current lifespan. Increasing the uptake of shared ownership opportunities for communities so that they are credible share ownership. Mandating developers to report on community benefit, updating good practice principles and making that index linked, but also to look towards creating a Scottish Communities Wealth Fund. One of the models that has been discussed with a number of different organisations and agencies is considering new modes of delivery. So rather than it being either community or external developer-led, how about a syndicate, perhaps the landowner, the community, and others? Those others might be the local authority, for example. Having a syndicate of organisations and individuals that come together in order to look at how can we finance this in a way that gets the payback back into our communities and back into Scotland, rather than externally into foreign-owned companies. So that's all I'm going to say at the moment, but happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Faye. That was fantastic, if not sobering. So thank you very much for that. Questions? Are there any questions? Looking around. I mean, I have one, if I may, Faye. Just, you mentioned this, the SNIB, the Scottish National Investment Bank. So what role is it playing? I mean, you just touched it in one line there. Mm-hmm. What are the prospects for it playing a role here? Because, you know, also talking about carbon credits and biodiversity credits, I can't help thinking that there is a role for a bank here.
Absolutely, there should be a role for SNIB, and for SNIB to be used as a mechanism to leverage funding into our communities. I think to date, we haven't seen community projects being delivered by SNIB, but there absolutely is. That they are looking at larger projects and projects of scale. So therefore, I think for this to realistically be delivered in communities, what we actually need to look at is collaboration amongst perhaps a number of different community organisations, rather than individually going to SNIB to ask for funding, but perhaps having a package of projects where there's 3 or 4 projects coming together requiring the funding in order for that to be attractive enough for SNIB to be interested. Personally, I think they're acting in a very commercial way, very much like an investment bank rather than a national bank. And I think we need to work at that in terms of opening up their eyes and their hearts perhaps a bit more towards communities, and not setting such high hurdle rates that communities might have to meet before they can get the funding. Exactly. I agree with that. Thank you. Any other comments? Yes.
Des, we've got an online question.
Okay.
If that's any help to you. So Afia online asks, says, great developmental plans covered, thank you. With plans to increase installations from a tourism geographic perspective, has there been any consideration of community attitudes towards place identity, as well as tourist perceptions of wind farms as threats to the idyllic landscape and rurality of the countryside?
So at the moment, from a planning perspective, all the information that gets delivered as part of the planning process is developer driven. It's developer driven consultants who undertake the environmental impact assessment, which also includes an economic impact assessment. And so far, looking at the EIAs that have been delivered for Skye, the data that they are using is mainland-based data for projects that are delivered in areas that I wouldn't consider to be tourist sensitive at all. So there's a real challenge there, because once there's a report in there that goes through the planning process and it's got that consultant stamp on it, then it becomes more difficult for us from the outside to challenge that. And I think a lot of these reports, particularly the ones on Skye, were undertaken during COVID. And it looks as if quite a lot of them have potentially been delivered without necessarily even setting foot on Skye. So I think there's a massive role here for challenging the tourism aspect. And unfortunately, the gloss that's put in it in terms of the planning applications that I've looked at for Skye is this won't impact on tourism.
Thank you, Faye. Any other questions? Yes, Agnes. Agnes, you'll need a microphone unless you want to come here. Do you want to come here, Mag?
Hi, Faye. Thanks very much for that. A couple of kind of very local questions in a way, which I'm interested in. The land that these proposed developments are going to happen on are undoubtedly privately owned land. Yeah. Is it common grazing?
In some cases, well, most cases actually, quite a lot of it is on common grazing.
In terms of how these communities have been engaged
Oh, sorry, Agnes, I didn't catch that question. No.
Is it on now?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Has that made any difference whatsoever to the way in which developers have engaged with the local community, especially the crofters?
It's probably just made the whole situation even more divisive. And where I say that is, it results in, I think people on Skye in particular seem to be very polite and they don't all want to fall out with each other. So I think what's happening is that there are crofters who are being told essentially that the landowners entered into negotiations or agreements with developers, and that because they have common grazings, that they inevitably they're going to benefit from it because they're going to receive a proportion of that rent, which then it leaves them in quite a quandary, because you have, in particular, for example, I don't know if you've seen much of the media coverage on Breakish in particular, where the crofter, there's an element of the crofters that are being quite vocal and they're against the projects, but there's also a number that are in favour, and obviously the majority is going to carry that over. And I think there is an opportunity for crofters to shape potentially what's going on if they engage with the developers at an early enough process. But to simply be carried along on the basis of, well, I haven't got a say, it's going to happen anyway, therefore I'll just take whatever comes in my direction, rather than actually shaping and influencing what could result in a much better outcome for them, but also for the communities they live in.
And sorry, this will be my very last point, which follows on from that. Has none of this at all raised any interest in community land ownership in these areas? If they were the owners, it would be a very different conversation.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think we have to recognise that 2 of the 4 community projects that I mentioned in the Western Isles are not on community-owned land. So community-owned land, there are opportunities outside of community-owned land, but I think the environment in Skye is very different to the Western Isles. In the Western Isles had been bought up by a lot of people who were living on the mainland, not necessarily having connections. And what we've seen in the Western Isles is a succession issue in many cases, where younger generations don't necessarily want to carry on with the ownership. In Skye, there's still an element of the clan-based system, in that we've still got areas of Skye that are owned by MacLeods, MacDonalds, and that seems to have quite a big influence on Skye, in that they're not remote landowners who appear once a year. They have more connections, which seems to influence what's going on. And interestingly, in one area in Skye, the department offered the crofters the opportunity to take on the land ownership and to have that transferred across to them, and they declined to do so. That's now a sizable chunk of the land that's going to be have turbines built on. So therefore, Scottish Government's actually going to be, in some cases, the landowner who will be benefiting from the income. And again, that's where maybe when we start looking at things like land reform, you've got to start asking, well, where's the development? Where's the money and the generation and the benefits coming back into the community from that particular public sector landowner?
Thank you, Faye. This conversation could go on a while, but I'll pass the mic to somebody else.
Yeah, no, that's excellent. It's a conversation that should go on. Faye, I'm going to draw a line under it at that, but thank you. That's a very lucid presentation you've given us. I very much hope that you can write up some of that, and I'd sort of like to offer an RSE blog as part of that, if that's possible, and I'd be happy to join forces with you in that, if that would help. But that you have given us an excellent presentation, and you deserve a further round of applause given what you've been through today. So thank you very much. So thank you, Faye. And you can stay with us, remain with us, or you can close off now. It's up to you.
I'll probably close off just now then.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. So that was, again, fantastic. We've been so privileged today with the presentations we've had, and I'm delighted to see that we now have Brian Wilson with us, who's going to give a final presentation. There's one thing I'm going to say in introducing Brian that will probably surprise him, so I'm just warning you now, Brian. But Brian's has had a distinguished political career as Labour MP for 18 years. He's had 5 ministerial positions, serves on the UK Board of Trade, founded the West Highland Free Press, and is now editor-at-large, that's a wonderful term, editor-at-large, for the Stornoway Gazette, and writing not just for the Stornoway Gazette, but for many other papers, including The Guardian. He's a visiting professor specialising in energy studies at the University of Strathclyde. And if I may, I should share with you 2 connections, at least 2 connections I have with Brian. The first is I canvassed for Brian when he stood as prospective Labour candidate for Ross and Cromarty in 1974 general election. Now, alas, Brian lost to the late and great Hamish Gray. He got just over 3,000 votes, I think 3,400 votes. But I only canvassed for Brian for a day, because in those days, Brian wore sandals. And I didn't think a prospective candidate in Tain wearing sandals had a hope of being elected. But actually, he did very well. And I should say it was 1974. There were 2 general elections that year. And this was the second one. Harold Wilson won, I think, with a majority of 3 seats, and endured a pretty difficult time until James Callaghan took over. The other means by which we know one another is that we had a shared friendship and a great affection for a fantastic writer and Labour activist, Alan Campbell MacLean, who some of you may have heard of, who wrote The Hill of the Red Fox, Ribbon of Fire, Year of the Stranger, and The Glass House. And I think it's probably fair to say that Alan shaped a good deal of Brian's political thinking, because he was an extraordinary Labour Party activist and mentor. So with that, I'm delighted, personally delighted as well, to hand over and to have Brian give us a personal perspective on the island's opportunities and challenges. Brian, over to you.
Well, thanks very much, Des, and belatedly thanks for canvassing for me. It's funny, it's, you can't remember, I don't know the number of the car I drove here in 5 minutes ago, but I remember the number of my first car, and in the same way, I've no idea how many people voted for me subsequently, but I do remember it in Ross and Cromarty, it was 3,440, and the most enjoyable election campaigns are the ones you have absolutely no chance of winning. Well, just before I start, just to get one small reminiscent of that the Liberal candidate in that election was extraordinary figure. He was an Edinburgh advocate called Tam Glen, and he was a very small man with a goatee beard and always wore it's an Inverness cape, it's called, but I mean the most unlikely guy to be padding the streets of Ross and Cromarty. And I always remember at the count, it was one of these life lessons in humility, that things can always get worse. But he was watching the Applecross box being opened, and when they were sorting their votes, he said bitterly, he says, even my own committee has voted against me. So after that, the only way is up. Can I apologise for being late and for, I don't know if the circumstances are explained, but anyway, I had a commitment I had to fulfil, and I'm sorry for upsetting the timetable, and thank you for rearranging it, but it also means that this is slightly upside down, because I'm going to speak fairly generally, and I'm sure you've been into much more granularity than if I'd been speaking first rather than last. But so that's a word of caution. And I was asked to talk a personal perspective on island opportunities and challenges, and that's a speech I've been making for a very long time, and around these same themes. And all I would say is that, you know, all these decades on, that the fundamentals remain the same. And in fact, listening to Faye there, and I'll come back to some of what Faye was talking about, but I couldn't help thinking, you know, that at the time Des is talking about the great issues of the great issue of the day on the West Coast, it wasn't wind farms, it was oil platform yards. And exactly the same discussions were going on, you know, this kind of whom discussions, you know, what for, who's this for, you know, what say do people have, what benefits are going to be, how do you extract benefit from it, or is just this something that's done to you and then you have to react to. And it is a bit sobering, you know, that really in so many ways absolutely nothing has changed. So the question of, you know, how you view the islands, I think that much of the answer lies in the eye of the beholder. Personally, I've always seen the opportunity that lies in getting it right, and the excitement, the potential to deliver policies in context which allow these places to flourish economically, culturally, creatively, vibrant communities with a rich heritage and a wonderful environment. And these never seem to me to be unattainable goals. Small populations, rich natural assets, great people. Surely it was possible to put these factors together and break down the barriers to success. But the mindset were everything, and there were other eyes and other beholders who saw it very differently. And the traditional view seen from afar, and particularly, if I may say so to this audience, from Edinburgh, is that islands are a problem. Now, sometimes this view is held benignly, and I've no doubt as it is by your own society, and that islands should be treated kindly and treated fairly, and their needs should be supported and their difficulties managed. There's also, of course, a harsher view, which is certainly prevalent within elements of the civil service. Islands are not only a problem, but they're a bloody nuisance. They're always wanting something, and it invariably costs money. We have to tolerate them, this school of thought runs, but keep them in a short leash, and certainly don't let them near the levers of power or the money box. And I have to say that this latter mentality generally rules the roost, as much now as it did 20 or 50 years ago. It's reflected in everything that government touches. Devolution has certainly done nothing, repeat nothing to change that, and arguably has made it worse. I can think of no powers which have been devolved from Edinburgh to the Western Isles, but I can point to many areas of public policy which have drawn such powers as existed away from the islands towards the centres. Now, there's no stated policy to achieve that outcome, but none needs to be written down. On the contrary, there are all sorts of gestures which are supposed to imply the opposite. There are island plans, connectivity plans, depopulation action plans, more plans than you can shake a stick at, each one relying heavily on cutting and pasting from the one before. Each of them oozing good intent, and none of them making any visible difference to the places they're supposed to be about. Though doubt was not the intention, plans for the islands drawn up in Edinburgh are symptomatic of the problem mentality. These places are so different and so in need that we need plans for them. But the one plan that is never considered is to allow them to plan for their own future well-being and destiny, and that would be a plan too far. But what if the eye of the beholder was different, and if it saw islands not as a problem, but as a glorious creative opportunity? What then would be the impact of public policy upon them? Now, that's an option which has never been put to the test and shows absolutely no sign of gaining favour in the corridors of suspicion and power. And that's the approach to islands which I've spent a disproportionate part of my life arguing for, a challenge to maintain economically healthy West Highland and Island communities which can retain their populations, offer great living environments, and in which language and culture can flourish. And I've always maintained the obvious, that the best way to achieve these outcomes is through policies which are determined within and are relevant to the places which are supposed to benefit from them. Islands, by definition, are different, and they require the application of micro-policies which are appropriate to their needs. and it's most definitely not all about money. It's also about mentality. The first patronising myth to challenge, though, is that islands are some kind of subsidy junkies. Nothing could be further from the truth. From Shetland's oil to Isla's whisky, through the fish in the sea and increasingly the energy produced, islands more than pay their way within both Scotland and the UK, and I'd love to see that balance sheet produced. These are only the tangibles. The intangibles include the entirely disproportionate contribution that islands make to the images which Scotland conveys to the world. In short, Scotland's islands far more than pay their way and should never be patronised into believing otherwise. Now, it would be gloomy to say that we're in crisis. There are many people here on this island, on every island, who live fulfilled lives in superb environments. It's a privilege to do so. Decline is gradual rather than glacial, but make no mistake, decline is taking place, and it's largely attributable to failures of public policy founded on long-range decision-making. The headline population numbers are near static, but the underlying reality is that we're moving gradually towards a situation in which there are not enough people of working age to sustain the services that an ageing population relies on. In-migration, while welcome, is not sufficient to counter the trickle of out-migration, and the same applies in most other islands. Recently, the finance director of the Western Isles Health Board summarised this challenge in stark terms. To correct the age imbalance and provide the necessary workforce on which health and care services, along with others, rely, the Western Isles need an additional 1,500 households. Now, that's a big, bold number, a fantastic challenge. I then look to South Harris and note the reality of it having taken 4 years and a high-profile public struggle going all the way to ministerial level to get consent for 12 houses in an area which had seen no new social housing built for 60 years. And that summarises the gap between needs and actions. I want to say something here about the importance of work. Unless there is reliable, well-paid employment in the islands which allow people to live here and raise their families, then many of them eventually leave. That's a reality. It's a long-standing reality. And it gradually seeps away the blue-collar workers and their families on which any society depends. They leave behind them those who are fortunate enough to be self-sufficient and who in many cases have no great interest in the wider economic or social conditions of the islands. Until that is, the reality comes to the door of there not being enough working-age people left to provide the services on which they depend. There's a tipping point in any island where more people are interested in stopping things happening than in making them happen. So what am I in favour of? For starters, the maximum devolution of decision-making to the islands themselves. I cannot think of one area of public policy which benefits from centralisation or remote control. I can see no argument for Crofting policy, or the lack of it, being directed from Inverness rather than from within the Crofting communities. I can see absolutely no case for ferry services being directed from Edinburgh via Quangos on which the islands are unrepresented. I can see no case for national housing criteria being applied to islands in which costs are high and flexible approaches to housing are crucial to keeping people in Crofting communities. All of these policy areas would be far, far better determined at local levels than at national ones, yet that is the leash that central government is so instinctively determined to keep hold of. When seen through the eye of the optimist and the potential which could be developed, the approach needs to be based on the requirements of small, self-contained island groups rather than as the extremities of a one-size-fits-all approach. There are 27,000 people in the Western Isles. They're spread over one medium-sized town and 100 small rural communities. The only approach which makes sense is to recognise that difference and allow policies to be formulated accordingly. Everyone's entitled to one good idea in life, and mine was when I was in the Scottish office prior to devolution, in a hurry to implement things I'd talked and written about for so long. One result was Immershek and Or, the initiative at the Edge, which was based on the premise that it is madness to have half a dozen government agencies solemnly administering the decline of island communities with tiny populations, each from a safe distance, rather than bringing it all together in an integrated, localised approach: housing, land, Crofting-like regulation, economic development. In other words, breaking down the silos of government, which are entirely inappropriate at this micro-Hebridean level. It wasn't mainly about money, it was by making things happen based on very local needs and problem solving. The civil servants hated it because they love their silos and they love their remote control. Immercheck and Orr and the thinking behind it didn't last for long once I was gone, but I still think it's the only rational approach. And I say this with due modesty, you need someone in government, and I don't mind from which party, who cares about these things, cares about them enough to take a sustained interest and make a difference. And that very rarely happens. The Scottish Government is awash with ministers, so why not a minister for the periphery who brings all of this together with one responsibility, rather than being scattered around among ministers who come and go with great regularity, leaving no mark at all. So there are two suggestions to go on with. Maximum devolution to the islands and a minister for the periphery. I have not the slightest expectation of either being acted on. But the prize in return for government would be to avoid the policy debacles of recent years, like highly protected marine areas, and there would be no need for any more plans. Actions would start to speak louder than words. Now, I'm going to speak very briefly about the future, and it reverts to some of the things Faye was talking about. Something quite extraordinary is going to happen on and around this island over the next decade. Billions of pounds, quite a few billions of pounds, are going to be invested in renewable energy infrastructure and generation. The question is whether this is going to be a short-term curse or a long-term blessing. Now, I greatly regret that this was not allowed to evolve over the past 20 years, in which case the economy and demography of the islands would now be very different. But we are where we are. The question now is what community benefit is going to be derived and what sustainable outcomes will be achieved. Or will it all be one long disruptive boom with little left to show for it? I cannot even attempt an answer to that question, but I hope someone's thinking about it. In this case, there does have to be a plan that people can help formulate and buy into, and we have to know what that plan is sooner rather than later. We need to know what community benefit is guaranteed and how it will be utilised in the long-term interest. We need to know where the skills, the people, the houses are going to come from. It's 2 years since the ScotWind round was announced, and we still know virtually nothing in response to these questions, and that has to change. It's undoubtedly the biggest potential development for this island in a century. On that basis, it should be embraced. But unless it is planned and the benefits are pinned down, it also has the potential to go badly wrong, something that is done to us rather than with us. There's still time to get this right, but we do need a plan, and we do need it soon. Thank you. Do you want me to?
Yeah, you stay there, because I'm sure there will be questions. Yeah. That's brilliant. Thank you, Brian. It's a terrific provocation you've given us there. Any questions? Or are you all stunned into silence? Sure. Yes, I've got one for you, Brian, but we'll go to the audience. Yes, yeah. Please. We can get one. Yes, if we can get you a microphone. Oh, it's here.
It's not so much a question. I'm just not sure how many people realise that currently we have at least 2,700 megawatts of wind turbines in the planning process for Lewis alone. So it's lovely to hear that community wind has been great, but boy, is that a chance for some money to be coming back in and to challenge that pathetic amount of, what was it, 500 per megawatt, I can't, 5,000 per megawatt, but 2,700 megawatts of wind turbines in planning, or at some stage, some of them not quite hit the planning yet.
Yeah, no, I think that what your initial few words are the crucial ones. You know, I don't think people realise, and I think it's very hard to grasp the scale of this. But if you collectively put together 2 offshore wind farms, 3 major onshore wind farms, a interconnector, converter stations, cables, all the rest of it. I'm not saying it's, I'm generally in favour of it, but it is colossal. I mean, it's utterly disproportionate to the population or to the infrastructure. I mean, maybe most important, the infrastructure. And I've no idea how it's going to be. I honestly have no idea how it is going to be delivered, or how it's going to be coordinated, or the timescales for each of these developments and how they fit in with each other. And the point about community benefit, I mean, it is community benefit is much more than whether a few quid for every megawatt or whatever the formula is. I mean, it has to be something that, ideally, which brings people back, brings people living here, creates the infrastructure in which they can live, fills the schools, and has a long-term impact on reversing the trends within the population. Now, I don't see any sign of that. And as I say, my preference, and I think a huge mistake was made here, and it was faultily in various faultily in the part of developers, faultily in the part of objectors, faultily in the part of everyone, that the opportunity should have been taken 20 odd years ago to kick this off, in which case there would have been an evolutionary process and people would be used to it and there would be a very, very different economy on this island. It didn't happen for reasons which, from which I bear the scars for. But I mean, but that is, if it had changed, that would have been very, very different. But what I don't think anybody invited or expected, or particularly wants, is this absolutely massive splurge within a decade, and how that is handled. I just wish there was some public debate about it.
Possibly starting it now, but yes, absolutely. Any more questions? Brian, sorry, I'll just speak into the microphone. Yeah. Brian, can I ask you about the housing issue? Something David and I were discussing earlier. So what are the constraints on the housing? Because the local employment depends so heavily on good housing, any housing. So what's the limiting factor here, given that we've got this massive expansion of housing in mainland Scotland?
Well, few people could probably answer it better than I. There are various constraints. One is cost, and so I mean, this is, as I said, I quoted the example of South Harris, where there's been this ridiculous delay in getting a small number of 12 houses built, in spite of the fact that South Harris is an extreme case of holiday homes and Airbnbs and all the rest of it, so it's almost literally impossible for anyone to get a house. So the cost of building is a factor. But if you accept that as a given, then you have to look at other solutions. And historically, the other solutions have lain in the fact that this is that these are crofting islands, and crofting tenure conveys, if properly regulated, which it no longer is, conveys great benefits and great opportunities. So there are ways, there are all sorts of schemes you could use for building or supporting the building of housing within crofting communities, which is what used to happen. Virtually all the houses you see that are more than 30, 40 years old were built through the Crofter Housing Grant and Loan Scheme, where own labour played a part, and all sorts of sensible things. Now, the breakdown of crofting tenure means, apart from the financial side, because the money's been taken away from that as well, but it also breaks down the potential for that, because that was based on people who were going to be living on the croft, maybe build a second house in the croft for family, something like that. So the thing kind of worked. But that if you've crofts being sold as assets, then just every time I see a sign saying croft for sale, they should be prosecuted, because it's false under the Trade Description Act. It's a system of tenure. It's a tenancy that's being sold, and yet people are buying something which doesn't really exist, and it's been encouraged to happen, and the breakdown of that system leads to these other problems. So you know, you need a far more diverse, and that's where I mean, I can't sum it, I can't sum it up in this time. But if the money, you know, why not? It's something like 34 million. I forget. Someone here will know the figure. Send the blinking cheque for 34 million and say how many houses can you build with that, and use every device at your disposal to do it, instead of saying, no, you can't build 6 houses there, but you can buy another field in the outskirts of Stornoway and build them there. You know, which is what happens in order to meet regulations which are set in Edinburgh without the slightest regard for how they impact upon here. And that's the kind of thing, you know, it's a trust thing. You know, say, well, it's failed. I mean, look at the population statistics. Look at the population of every rural area of the West Highlands and Islands, and you'll find the same problems. It's failed. Maybe something else would work. But they can never, the mindset is never capable of saying that.
It has failed, Brian, but we heard about some places where it's working. I mean, Colonsay is a very good example. It's a small island, but I think 24 houses being built there.
Yeah.
So, you know, there's some lessons we have to learn here, I think.
Colonsay was one of the pilot areas for Immerchick and Orr.
Yes. Sorry, it's all right.
Hello. I doubt the last census will capture this, but I mean, certainly grew up on the island from 11 onwards, been away in Glasgow for the last 15 years and have been able to move back. A large part of that was because of COVID. The technological developments came along that then allowed remote working, so my wife can be based in an office out of Glasgow but work here remotely. Do you think those sort of developments could have any impact on the sort of repopulation of rural areas that we might see in the next few years?
100%. Yeah, I mean, which is why it's so important that the technology is there to support it. But again, if you look at what's happened there, I don't like to always be critical of things, but you know, but the thing, the R100 thing is a complete joke in the Western Isles. You know, half the houses aren't going to be covered with it. You're going to get a voucher, which is incapable of being spent. I mean, and that's the box ticked. But they handed it over. The first thing they did was they handed it over to BT. And I actually heard the guys in charge of it for BT saying, you know, outside in is a politician's solution. It's not an engineer's solution. So we're not doing that. We'll do it inside out. And in other words, do it in the centres, and the peripheries left with their vouchers. So it's not very constructive. But of course, in general, I mean, I sit in Manchester and you know, do a lot of work from there that I wouldn't have been able to do 10 years ago. So it's I'm an example of it. Yeah.
Anyone else? That's great. Let's leave it at that. Brian, can we thank you again for a great conversation?
Okay.
Now, before we close, Chris, would you mind just sharing some reflections? Thank you.
So, I think that's called pulling the short straw. Thanks very much. But actually, when I was listening to all these presentations, actually a warm glow came over me, because you've answered all the questions that I posed at the very beginning of the meeting. So, you know, super. I've learned so much, and I wanted to learn. And some of the comments or some of the information has just been so revealing. I've got some scribbled notes here, and they're not necessarily in any particular order. But can I just say, I think I can beat your story about Brian Wilson's sandals, because the first time I met Brian, which was probably early 1970s, he and his late friend Jim Innes were on a train with myself and Martin O'Neill and Douglas Henderson going to, I think it was an NUS conference in Margate, and I can't remember if it was you or Jim who had a white boiler suit on. And I thought, brothers, we're on the way to revolution here, but it didn't quite happen. Anyway, I mean, I think the other comment I totally agree with in terms of what Brian said is blue-collar workers, absolutely crucial. I spent half of my time on Skye, And I came up to my place in Stein the other day, and the heating wasn't working. So I had to get an engineer, the guy I work with, I use in Edinburgh actually. And he was away in Inverness. His other gas engineer was working in Trotternish, so I couldn't get assistance, but he suggested I get in touch with Callergas. I got in touch with Callergas, and the engineer was based in Fraserburgh. So it takes a long time on these islands to get just a simple service. So you're in Glasgow or Dundee or whatever, you know, you'd phone up and somebody would be there, you know, certainly on the same, probably on the same day. Anyway, there we are. We cannot survive. These communities cannot survive without key workers, actually, and that requires, as everyone's saying, housing and all the other sort of infrastructure, social and economic that you've talked about. I wanted to say this. I think a number of David and Agnes and Rona have indirectly dealt with an issue that I'm interested in, and that is we can see the hugely important role of communities taking the initiative and driving change and taking responsibility, if you like, and that resilience. But the question that arises is, to me anyway, and I asked it at the beginning, was what is the role of the state, of the government in all of this? You know, how much does your initiative depend on things outside happening? And so, for example, I think you mentioned the new development, Stornoway Pier there, where big ships, tourist ships are going to arrive, and that's going to be helpful for the economies of your communities. So there's external factors which can be damaging, but it also could be advantageous. But Brian has quite rightly said, or talked about the way that the government has numerous policies or statements of intent, but my question is, how useful are they? How useful has the Scottish Government, how useful has devolution been in terms of what's going on currently in the islands? And there's clearly a view that not a lot of good is coming from it, but could do. But of course the answer, as we all know, and this is a political point and I shouldn't really make it, and I'm going to wrap my knuckles after having said it, but the answer is independence. When we have that, everything will be okay. So anyway, so what else was I going to say? Yeah, I have mentioned the point about community initiative, and that kind of determination to make things happen, I think, is so important. So it kind of disappointed me a bit when I was listening to Faye, whose work I know about, given my Sky connections, that it was hugely interesting when she talked about the crofters there, or some of them anyway, because the opinion is divided on Sky in terms of this these huge developments that are being planned, that so many people are saying yes to them, when in fact, because it's because it's inevitable. And yet we've talked earlier today, and I know a lot from what I've read about the enormous sense of history and the sense of resistance, if you like, and determination on the Western Isles. It's disappointing to me that on Skye, which has a great history too of resistance to adverse external forces like clearance and so forth, that resistance, that, you know, the Glendale martyrs and all the rest of it, that spirit seems to have gone. But it seems, and I said earlier on, there's so much difference between the islands, that on Skye that spirit, it appears is not what it once was, and it's certainly not there to the extent it seems to be out out here, for example. So that kind of disappointed me, concerns me. And I was glad though that at the end, I think you asked Agnes the question about the impact of all of this on something which is quite measurable, really, and that is the impact that those turbines, if they are built on Skye, would have on tourism. It means, you know, a huge amount of the economy of Skye is dependent on tourists, and if that landscape is no longer there, what happens? And I think that it's up to Faye and others to make more of that threat to the landscape. So look, I've enjoyed this afternoon. It's been great. All the presentations have been, I think, hugely illuminating, hugely interesting, answered the questions I hoped would be answered. There's more answers coming tomorrow, I'm sure. So we're winding up today, and I hope we can see all of you tomorrow at what time is it? 9 o'clock. So 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, we reassemble and we look forward to another super day. So for those contributions today and for Des for chairing, thanks very much. Enjoy your evening.